Sunny stared at the menagerie of monsters for a bit, getting used to the fact that his eyesight was different now too. His eyes seemed to be much keener and were naturally able to see in utter darkness, as opposed to being gifted this trait by his aspect, but had trouble differentiating colors. The world was basically black and white, or rather consisted of various shades of gray, similar to how he used to see the world through shadows. His sense of smell was also enhanced, overloading his mind with an avalanche of new information. It was hard to concentrate on any one thing, let alone make sense of all this mess. Sunny muttered, "Ah, who cares? Let's just get out of here." Just like in the Night Temple, the cage limited his shadow sense. However, this one did not sap him of shadow essence, which was a pleasant surprise. Sunny's joy was short-lived, however. As soon as he tried to shadow step away, he realized that he couldn't teleport through the iron bars. What's more, even his shadows couldn't slide through them, as though there was an invisible barrier blocking their way. Sunny gritted his teeth and felt a sharp pain as his fangs sunk into the soft flesh inside his mouth. He tried to curse and produced a furious growl instead. After that, he simply remained motionless for a bit, staring at the other prisoners of the dungeon with gloomy resentment. Sunny spat a bitter curse it all. Finally, he shook his head and awkwardly knelt at the bottom of the cage, grasping the iron bars with all four of his hands. Moving twice the amount he had possessed previously was a bit of a challenge, but he did manage after a couple of attempts. Sunny muttered, "Fine, there are other methods. I'll melt this whole damned cage if necessary." He stretched one hand through the bars and summoned the cruel sight. And then, nothing happened. The only thing that changed was that his steel collar turned a little colder for a moment. Sunny frowned, his black eyes growing even darker, then tried again. The somber weapon did not appear. There was no tenebrous mist shrouding his hand, and no feeling of a small portion of his shadow essence disappearing to grant the memory a physical shape. Feeling unease, Sunny lingered for a second, and then tried to summon the midnight shard. Once more, his collar grew colder for a moment, and nothing happened. Sunny stammered, What is going on?" One after another, Sunny tried to manifest all of his memories to the same result. His memories refused to appear, and not even a single spark of ethereal light ignited in the darkness of the dungeon. It was almost as though they were all gone, stolen, even Weaver's mask. Panicking, he hurriedly summoned the runes, hoping to see that he was wrong, that the list of his memories did not turn empty. Sunny cried, "No, no, 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 no." But the familiar shimmering runes did not appear. There was nothing in the air in front of him, just cold and dark emptiness. Sunny breathed. Wait, what? Sunny called the runes forth again and again, but they were inexplicably gone. His collar was now as cold as ice. Sunny gasped, "Can't be." It was almost as though he was completely cut off from the spell. When the realization hit him, Sunny leaned heavily on the bars of the cage and remained motionless for a while, utterly stunned. What kind of a nightmare was that? How was it even possible to lose connection to the spell? It was the spell, damn it, the terrifying almighty spell. Who could snatch an awakened away from it? He wasn't even able to enter his soul sea. The scale and scope of this tectonic change simply failed to fit into his mind. Sunny had spent so long living with the spell that he almost didn't remember what existing without it felt like. It was as though an integral part of his being was suddenly taken away, leaving him hollow and incomplete. Sunny whispered, "I don't understand." He was still trying to cope with this new reality when heavy footsteps suddenly resounded in the ghastly dungeon. Raising his head, Sunny saw a giant of a man walking between the hanging cages, his powerful figure radiating a sense of vast, solemn strength. The man was wearing a worn leather armor and a tattered red robe, its edges frayed and torn. On his back, a barbarous curved blade hung, wide and heavy enough to split any abomination in half, and on his belt, heavy chains rattled with each step. The giant's face was hidden beneath a hood, but Sunny didn't need to see it to know that he was looking at an ascended, and that ascended was walking straight to his cage. Sunny muttered, Now is my chance. But to do what exactly? Sunny was not accustomed to his new monstrous body and was devoid of the ability to summon memories. He was unarmed and defenseless. He didn't even know if his aspect still worked. What was he supposed to do? Try to fight a master with his bare fists, claws, or whatever, or wait and see what happens? In the end, the cautious part of his mind won. Sunny silently stared as the man in the red robe approached the cage, glanced at him, and then somehow made the iron bars disappear without a trace. One moment they were there, and the next, they were gone, throwing Sunny to the ground. The giant cruelly slammed his massive fist into Sunny's head, and before he had a chance to shrug off the disorientation, a thick chain was already fastened to his collar. Then, Sunny was dragged somewhere, sliding across the dirty floor as the collar dug painfully into his neck. Not too long after that, bright sunlight suddenly blinded him. A sharp pain pierced his black eyes, and a moment later Sunny was thrown ruthlessly to the ground, landing on it in a graceless heap. Still unable to see, he felt the chain being removed from his collar. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the light, and even though his vision was not as good as it had been in the darkness, Sunny was able to see that he was sprawled on the stone floor of a circular arena. All around him, rows of seats rose, cut from pristine white stone to form a vast amphitheater. The theater was not crowded, and yet there were a lot of humans seated in it, looking down at him with joy and excitement. They were dressed in simple tunics and other kinds of archaic garments, most of them of some shade of red. The arena itself was not white like the rest of the amphitheater. Instead, it was dull red too, or rather it might have been pristine once, but now its stone surface had absorbed too much blood and changed color. Sunny looked up and saw another monster being let off its chain some distance away. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Yes, he was a slave again, but it seemed that this time fate had made him a very different kind of slave. Sunny muttered, "Wait, don't tell me." As the crowd of spectators cheered, the other monster roared, spun around, and fixed its bloodthirsty eyes on Sunny. Sunny breathed. "It's a damned Colosseum." Sunny just woke up in a blood-stained Colosseum with a monster staring him down. So if you want more people to find this story, hit like on this episode. Now let's see how he survives the arena. There were wooden fences built throughout the arena, partitioning it into many small enclosures, each connected to a next one by a rusty iron gate. Currently, Sunny was at the very edge of the Colosseum, with one of its stone walls behind him. 3 sturdy fences formed the rest of the killing box, sharp spikes mounted on them to prevent the combatants from trying to escape. And that was unmistakably where he found himself, a Colosseum. A theater of death where slaves fought each other for the entertainment of the crowd, unless they wanted to be slaughtered by the other gladiators or their own masters. Granted, this one was rather strange. For one thing, the slaves were predominantly wild beasts and monsters of all kinds, as opposed to captured humans. The crowd was behaving weirdly too. After his experience in the dreamscape, Sunny expected to see the spectators overwhelmed by bloodthirst and dark, cruel fascination. Instead, these people seemed to be joyful and proud, almost solemn. It was as though they were genuinely happy for the gladiators, even a little bit jealous. The crowd was undulating and shifting, singing one word over and over again. "Glory, glory, glory." Their voices merged into an echoing, thunderous roar. Sunny muttered, "What the hell is wrong with these bastards?" Sadly, Sunny didn't have a lot of time to think about the weirdness of the audience. He had bigger problems on his plate. Right in front of him, another creature was let go of the chain, its powerful body covered in dirty brown fur. 4 mighty paws, a long muzzle with terrifying fangs, and 6 eyes burning with madness. It was very similar to the dread wolves he had thought at the island covered by strange, twisted trees. And it wasn't alone. 2 more beasts appeared from behind the first one, falling low to the ground as guttural growls escaped from their maws. Sunny spat, "Damnation." Sunny shifted his gaze, trying to discern the rank and class of the murderous beasts. They seemed a lot smaller than the fallen monster he had killed before, at least, simply the size of a bull instead of a full cargo vehicle. His newfound ability to peer into the souls of living things and see their soul cores was going to come in handy. However, what he saw beneath their tough hides left him confused. Instead of spheres of radiant light, the creatures had hideous masses of swirling darkness at the center of their beings, veins of it spreading throughout their souls like cancerous growths. In the depths of that darkness, something unclear seemed to be moving as if trying to break free. The sight of it was both frightening and repulsive. It reminded him, somewhat, of the harrowing rot he had witnessed in the ebony toe, growing from the severed arm of Weaver. So this is what soul cores of the nightmare creatures look like. Sonny had no idea how to judge the rank of such cores, since he only knew to measure the usual ones by their size and luminosity. The growths of darkness in the dread wolves seemed to have 2 swirling nodes each, which at least told him that they were mere monsters. Not that it helped him very much. How was he supposed to fight against 3 monsters while barely being able to stand upright in this new, unfamiliar body? Sonny cursed. Curse it. He was also not at all happy with the fact that this gaunt and powerful body was standing more than 2 meters tall, devoid of any fat, and stark naked, with all his stuff hanging loose for everyone to see or bite off. Plus, there were a lot of women in the crowd. Hiding his discomfort, Sonny stared at the wolves, his black eyes full of menacing resentment. His lips parted, revealing sharp fangs that were in no way inferior to that of the monstrous beasts. A low growl escaped from his mouth. Sonny snarled, "Come on, look how big and scary I am. You wouldn't want to fight a scary demon like me, would you? One would have to be insane to attack such a monstrosity." Sadly, this was exactly what nightmare creatures were: insane. The wolves lunged forward, madness burning in their bloodshot eyes. Their maws opened, foam glistening on jagged fangs. The crowd roared. Sonny cursed, "Damn it all." Sonny commanded the shadows to wrap themselves around his body, which suddenly turned black and lusterless, as though cut from obsidian. Thankfully, at least that part of his aspect still worked. Almost instantly, his might quadrupled, and so did his speed. He dashed through the darkness and appeared from the shadow of one of the wolves, his 4 hands shooting forward to grab the beast's sharp claws sinking into the soft flesh. Sonny was still struggling to control his body, and for that reason. His movements were much slower and messier than they could have been. But embraced by the 3 shadows, he simply used brute power to overcome that disadvantage. Raising the massive monster above his head, he hissed and pulled with all his might. Lean muscles moved like steel cables under his onyx skin, and in the next moment, a river of blood flowed onto his horned head from above as the body of the wolf was mercilessly torn apart. The crowd went wild, their voices growing loud and triumphant. At least those spectators who were close to his enclosed box. Sonny muttered, What are you screaming for, idiots?" Sonny was more than a little startled by the violent strength of his new body. It was much more powerful than his human one. However, it was also much taller, and his center of gravity was much further from the ground. For that reason, Sonny miscalculated his posture completely, lost his balance, and toppled over as soon as the dread wolf's body lost its integrity. He crashed onto the bloodied stones, instinctively raising 2 of his 4 hands to cover his throat. Almost instantly, one of the remaining 2 monsters was upon him, its maw opening wide before closing around his neck like a crushing bear trap. Luckily, Sonny's arms were already in the way, so instead of tearing his throat open, the wolf only managed to bite into them, sharp fangs burrowing through tough skin, piercing flesh and scraping against bone. Overwhelmed by the explosion of terrible pain and the sudden fall, Sonny momentarily forgot how to control his limbs and operate the shadow demon's body. The second wolf jumped on him, tearing his abdomen with long claws. Sonny let out a furious snarl of pain. Not good. This was not good. He was pinned to the ground, defenseless, seconds away from being disemboweled and having his head torn off. And he couldn't even remember how many hands he had and what to do with them. Sonny shuddered, then opened his mouth and roared. His bestial scream washed over the wolves, momentarily stunning them. Then he moved his 2 upper hands, grasping the first wolf by the jaws, and simultaneously threw his lower arms around the second one. Twisting his body, Sunny threw the monster digging into his abdomen off and pinned it to the stones, at the same time pushing the maw away from his neck. Growling menacingly, he pulled the jaws of one of the monsters apart, while crushing the other in a devastating embrace. The three of them struggled furiously for a few moments, more and more gashes and lacerations accumulating on Sunny's body. The pain flooded his mind, clearing it of all unnecessary thoughts. All that remained was a cold and murderous will to kill. He strained the muscles of his demonic body to the limit, and finally felt the spine of one of the wolves snap in his embrace, and at the same time, the lower jaw of the other one separate from its skull. A pitiful wail assaulted his ears, and he threw the paralyzed monster away, ripping the other's jaw off entirely. Both wolves fell to the ground, while Sunny was finally able to rise. His fists came down like sledgehammers, crushing the skulls of the abominations into paste. The massive bodies of the nightmare creatures shuddered and then grew still. Sunny was left kneeling, his chest rising and falling heavily. His naked body was covered in deep lacerations and blood, most of it not his own. His eyes were as black as the bottomless abyss of the sky below, and his four hands hung low, claws marred with strands of brown fur, bone dust, and disgusting grayish-red sludge. The crowd cheered loudly, more spectators starting to pay attention to his box with disturbingly joyful and sincerely pleased expressions on their faces. Sunny sucked in the air into his four lungs, his two hearts beating wildly, and slowly rose to his feet. He scowled, painfully aware of the absence of the familiar voice announcing his kills. The spell was silent. Now what? As though to answer his question, a rattling of chains resounded from somewhere up ahead. And then, the rusty iron gate in the front fence of the box rose, opening a path to a new one, this one closer to the center of the arena and permeated with the smell of death even more. Sunny stared at the newly opened path with a bleak expression, then let out a low growl and walked toward it, now acquainted with his towering body a little bit better. Sunny snarled, "Damned solving. That witch. I am going to kill her. Kill her again, I mean. Anyway, she's going to answer for everything before the nightmare is over. This, I promise before the gods." Radiating a menacing aura of anger and resentment, Sunny passed beneath the rusted gates and entered the second box. As Sunny was walking toward the next enclosure, he had a few seconds to think. The first thing he realized was that, despite the fact that the spell remained silent, he had in fact received the shadow fragments from the three dread wolves. The feeling of his cores and thus body growing a tiny bit stronger was there, even though it was hard to sense the minuscule change in all the chaos. Sunny murmured, "Strange. This is all so strange." His connection to the spell seemed to be gone, cut by the steel collar on his neck, and yet not all of his powers disappeared. Sunny couldn't access his soul, see, and summon memories or runes, but he still possessed the ability to absorb fragments. He was also able to command his shadows to augment his body, as well as use Shadow Step, even though its range seemed to be limited by the walls of the arena. What did it all mean? Well, from the look of it, while the spell was gone, his aspect remained. There was a lot of meaning hidden in this simple fact, but Sunny had no time to unpack it. What else was his aspect capable of? Walking under the rusty gate, Sunny hesitated for a split second and then summoned the Soul Serpent. A moment later, almost unnoticeable on his obsidian skin, an intricate tattoo of a coiling serpent appeared, wrapped around his arms and torso. When Sunny sent shadow essence coursing through it, the coils shone with dark radiance, revealing themselves for everyone to see. His lips moved, revealing powerful fangs and a frightening grin. Sunny murmured, "So you are here as well, buddy." What did it mean? It meant that Sunny didn't have to fight unarmed anymore. It also meant that Saint was with him as well. He might not have been the most deadly of creatures at the moment, still unaccustomed to this new lumbering body. But the two of them. Together, Sunny and Saint were a duo most fearsome. Full of new confidence, he entered the second killing box, sending his shadow sense forward to encompass it. What he saw there made him squint a little. There was already a battle going on in the enclosure, a pair of humans desperately trying to fight off a swarm of small, swift lizard-like creatures. Both of them wore white tunics, the younger one unarmed. while the older one had a simple sword in his hands and a leather cuirass protecting his torso. There were several human corpses laying on the ground, terribly disfigured by the sharp claws and triangular fangs of the abominations, with their once white clothes soaked in blood. Sonny shifted his gaze and saw the vile darkness spreading through the souls of the lizard-like gremlins. From the look of it, they were all awakened, the same as the wolves he had fought. Sonny measured the strength of the monsters during the battle and judged their rank to be the same as his. The younger man was an awakened as well, with a single radiant soul core, while the older one had none at all. He was a mundane human. As Sonny watched, the older warrior was finally overwhelmed and fell to the ground, the gremlins easily tearing through his cuirass and sinking their claws and teeth into the soft flesh beneath. The young man screamed and dashed to help him, but it was already too late. Even though the awakened youth managed to kill several beasts with his fists and push the others away, his partner was already mortally wounded. He shuddered, a river of blood flowing from a ghastly gash in his neck, and weakly pushed the hilt of the sword into the younger man's hands. The crowd went wild, happily chanting the same damned word. Glory, glory, glory. The last surviving human raised his head, pain and sorrow mixing with hatred in his light blue eyes. He didn't get to dwell on his loss for long, though, because the remaining gremlins were already rushing to tear him apart. Some, however, found a new target. Sonny grunted and tried to control his body as precisely as possible. He didn't command the soul serpent to assume the form of a weapon or summoned saint yet, preferring to keep his cards hidden for now. The lizard-like abominations did not seem too dangerous, anyway, at least not with their remaining numbers and their attention split between two targets. Sonny muttered, "Curses." The four-armed demon's gaunt body was too tall, heavy, and unwieldy. Every motion required more effort, and was slower than he was used to. Even though there was inhuman strength in the shadow creature's steel muscles, which was supposed to translate into explosive speed, dragging so much mass around was still different from operating a small and slim human body he had possessed before. Sonny grumbled. Who would have thought that I would miss being short one day? 4 gremlins jumped at Sonny at the same time, more of them lagging a second behind. Their narrow eyes shone with rabid bloodlust, and their jagged claws were aimed at his flesh, lusting to rip it apart. Wrapped in shadows, with the coils of the soul serpent shining darkly on his skin, Sonny took a step forward and caught all 4 creatures from the air, then slammed their skulls against each other, crushing them. Even though he was having trouble controlling his new body. How could these beasts ever hope to survive a battle against a demon? And a very special one at that. Sonny bared his teeth and lunged forward, a low growl escaping from his mouth. His forearms moved, crushing flesh and bone. Several beasts managed to slip past his assault and sink their claws into his thighs, one even trying to bite off a big chunk of flesh. Sonny hissed from pain and crouched, using his claws to rip 4 more gremlins apart. There was no free hand to finish off the last one, so he simply bit off its arm with his sharp fangs. Feeling the bone crunch and the disgusting taste of corrupted blood on his tongue, Sonny gagged and groaned about wanting to vomit. Sonny spit a mouthful of fetid, dark blood and silenced the shrieking creature with a bone-shattering backhand slap. Suddenly, the box became deathly silent. He groaned, overwhelmed by pain for a moment. The damned abominations had died rather easily, but not before doing a lot of damage. He might have overestimated his newfound prowess. Or underestimated the gremlins due to their small stature and frail frames. The irony. Sonny gritted his teeth, this time careful not to pierce his own lips by doing so, then wiped his face and straightened. Finally, he glanced in the direction of the remaining group of abominations. To his surprise, they were already dead. The young awakened had slaughtered them with the sword somehow, and was now standing there motionlessly, frozen stiff by fear. The youth was staring at him with a pale face, eyes wide with terror. Then he took an unsteady step back and whispered,
O gods, Lord, protect me against the hideous demons of the night."
Sonny looked down at him from his immense height, his cobalt-black body covered in terrible wounds and blood more streaming from between his sharp fangs. He suppressed the desire to roll his eyes. Sonny muttered, "Hideous, rude." Sonny glanced down at the young man, then slowly moved toward him. The awakened shuddered and took another involuntary step back, then gritted his teeth and lowered his stance, raising the sword into a proper defense position.
Lord, shine thine light upon me. Let my soul burn unextinguished, as the sun can never be extinguished.
I've seen suns fade away and disappear before. Never say never, fool.
Sonny listened to the strange prayer and allowed one of his shadows to slide off his menacing body, flowing to the ground like a dark veil. After that, he hissed from pain and stopped near a mangled human corpse. He stared at the trembling youth for a few moments, and then bent down, stretching his hands toward the body.
Get your vile hands away from him, demon.
Sonny ignored the awakened and used his claws to rip the white tunic off the corpse. Then he straightened and glanced at it with displeasure, his black eyes narrowing. This one was not too dirtied by blood, but sadly, its previous owner was of a normal size for a human. As such, the tunic was way too small for Sonny's new towering body. He snarled and then tried to tie the tunic around his waist like a makeshift loincloth. There was a big problem, though. His tail. Sonny froze, somewhat confused about what to do. Then he awkwardly tore a hole in the tunic and made another attempt, this one, thankfully, successful. With his nakedness finally covered, he instantly felt better and turned his attention back to the trembling youth. The young man was staring at him with wide eyes, periodically glancing at the unceremoniously disrobed corpse at his feet. Finally, he opened his mouth.
You barbarous beast, have you no shame?
Sonny grinned, revealing 2 rows of sharp fangs and 4 long, terrifying canines. In the next moment, though, his smile dimmed because there was suddenly a familiar pressure rising in his mind. So his flaw remained as well. Sonny muttered, "Damn it." He hesitated, then slowly shook his head. Instantly, the pressure disappeared. Sonny grumbled, "Figures. I can't escape the damned curse even when I'm mute. How is this even fair?" The awakened blinked.
No, of course not. Why would a demon know shame? It's, wait, you can understand me.
With the spell gone, its magical ability to translate any language in the nightmare was gone too. However, Sonny found himself able to discern what the young man was saying, as well as the only word the spectators seemed to know, even if it demanded some effort. The language they spoke was not exactly the same as the ones he had learned before, first in the academy and later during his travels in the dream realm, but similar enough to make out some of the words. He was able to deduce the rest. Sonny stared at the youth from above, then nodded darkly. The young man blinked.
Wait, you are not one of the corrupteds then. What kind of a creature are you?
Sonny scowled. The word meant something that was tainted, infected, changed, and perverted. A being cursed with some form of corruption. But what exactly was the awakened asking? Was he referring to the nightmare creatures, perhaps? He hesitated, then shook his head again, and pointed to the coils of the soul serpent glistening on his skin. The youth frowned, confused.
A snake, a serpent. Can that demon be Shadow's kin? No wonder the warriors hunted him down then. Their god and Shadow are old enemies.
Is he talking to me or to himself?
Sonny lingered for a moment, then took a step forward. The awakened flinched, torn away from his pondering, and raised his sword higher.
Stay away, demon, or I will.
He felt silent when the gaunt, towering monstrosity walked past him with absolute indifference. Sonny wasn't going to fight the youth. Unless the fool chose to attack first, of course. Made into a gladiator or not, he was not going to play the part of an obedient slave. He had no qualms with killing humans, but not to satisfy anyone's thirst for entertainment, especially not of anyone wishing to be his owner. They would have to come down in person if they wanted to force him. He studied the dead humans, men, women, young and old. The only thing in common they had was the color of their white garments. Some had been unarmed and some had wielded weapons. The weapons were what he was really interested in. There was a couple laying on the red stones, none of them bearing any enchantments. He picked up a battle axe, glanced at it, and then threw it back to the ground. What was the point of having a mundane weapon? His claws were sharper and far more devastating. Luckily, the young man seemed to have decided against using the sword against him too. He just stood there staring at the corpses, a dark and inconsolable expression on his face. The steward of the arena, whoever that was, did not seem to want them to kill each other as well. With a sound of scraping metal, another rusty gate rose, opening the path to the third box, this one even closer to the center of the Colosseum. Sonny and the young awakened glanced at each other warily, and then walked toward the gate together. Sonny's next cage was larger and more comfortable. Well, he at least could stand up straight in it. Not that he was in any mood to do so. In the end, he had been forced to fight his way through 7 killing boxes, the last circular one at the very heart of the Colosseum. In each box, a new nightmare creature, or a group of them, awaited. Those abominations who had prevailed in their own battles at the outer circles of the arena. In this way, only the strongest and the most ferocious of the enslaved creatures had a chance to reach the center. The further they went, the louder the cheers of the spectators became, and on the final stage, their salvation awaited. Kill the final enemy and get the chance to live another day, only to be forced to go through this meat grinder again undoubtedly, collecting more wounds, more kills. More glory. Sonny had received a lot of injuries. As for the glory, he wasn't so sure. Currently, he was sprawled on the bottom of a hanging cage, his body a map of gashes, lacerations, and bruises. Everything hurt, but at least he wasn't bleeding. That was the benefit of losing his chance to receive Shadow God's lineage. He was slowly healing. In the cage next to him, the awakened with light blue eyes sat, an empty and hollow expression on his smooth, youthful face. The young man had somehow managed to survive as well, but grew quiet and despondent after they were brought back to the dungeon. Sonny didn't blame him. He was a bit desperate too. Yes, they had survived today, but just barely, and who knew how many such days there were going to be in the future. Somehow he had a disturbing feeling that once someone had entered the arena, they never left it alive. Sonny closed his eyes, exhausted. So what if his fate was to die as a slave in this cursed Colosseum? Fate was not something immutable. It was just very, very hard to change. Was he or was he not the heir to the demon of fate? If anyone could do it, it was him. Caged in the darkness, Sonny had a lot of time to think. All around him, a horde of nightmare creatures waited for their turn to be slaughtered in the blood-soaked arena, a few unfortunate human slaves among them. Here in the nightmarish dungeon, both abominations and people were the same, equal in the face of inevitable death. His thoughts returned to the very start of the trial, to the announcement the spell made. 5 brave ones. Someone else had entered the nightmare with them. And Sonny had a good idea who. Mordred. The Prince of Nothing still lived against all odds and had found a way to reach his goal. Perhaps his reflection had hidden in the eyes of Saint Cormac, and then slid unnoticed into either Effie's or Kai's. Was one of his friends dead? No, that didn't make sense. If Mordred had devoured one of the souls aboard the ancient flying ship, then someone would have noticed. The Fire Keepers were a close group, and knew each other too well to miss a sudden change in the demeanor of one of them. As for Effie and Kai, if they had fallen victim to Mordred's terrifying ability, then there would have been only 4 souls entering the nightmare. But who was to say that the Prince of Nothing had to invade a soul once his reflection jumped into the person's eyes? Maybe he could just hide in the reflections, biding his time and waiting for an opportunity to find a better vessel. And speaking of vessels, Sonny studied his monstrous body, his black eyes full of a somber apprehension. Why had he been sent into a body of a demon? The spell was supposed to find suitable vessels for the challengers. Had he been made into a hideous abomination because of his 3 shadow cores? After all, it was hard to find a human with a soul worthy of a divine aspect. If so, was Mordred in the body of a terror right now? Hidden in the darkness, Sonny shivered. Yes, this was most likely the case. This fact had the potential to either reveal itself to be a blessing or a curse. In theory, all 5 of them had the same goal: to resolve the conflict of the nightmare and ascend. So, having a terror fight on their side would be a boon no matter how much resentment Sunny had for the bastard. He also suspected that Mordred wielded the ivory knife, increasing their chances of success even further. But Sunny also remembered what Master Jet had told them. Not all of the Awakened trying to conquer the trial of the spell had to pursue the same goal. Sometimes, their solutions and ideals clashed, making them enemies. The idea of having Mordred as an enemy in this already insurmountable hell scared him. The Prince of Nothing was maybe the most dangerous opponent he had ever faced. Would Mordred turn on the other 4 humans that had entered the seed? It was impossible to tell. He was not cruel for the sake of cruelty, and was not nearly as insane as everyone seemed to think. His hatred was directed toward Valor and not them. But at the same time, Sunny could not say that the banished prince was completely of sound mind. Something about him. When Sunny looked Mordred in the eyes, it felt as though something was missing in them. It was a very small difference, but one that made facing the Prince of Nothing strangely unsettling. Mordred was a wild card. One whose actions Sunny simply could not predict. No point in dwelling on it right now. Unless I find a way to escape this morbid place alive, all that awaits me is death anyway. He shifted and hissed slightly as pain radiated through his body, originating from countless wounds. Sunny thought back to his battle in the arena. Strange. It was all so strange. Some of his powers were gone, but others remained. His aspect seemed to be unaffected, but his connection to the spell was gone. Then, did this mean? Did this mean that an aspect was not a part of the spell, but instead existed outside of it? Trapped in an unbreakable enchanted cage, Sunny scowled. A long, long time ago, back when he had passed the first nightmare and received his aspect, it had felt as though the power was coming from somewhere deep within him, as opposed to from an external source. Was the spell only awakening inherent powers that were locked inside human souls and not creating them? Sunny murmured, "Wait a minute." Come to think of it, Aro of the Nine had claimed to be an awakened, and while the youth sitting silently in the nearby cage had not said it, he was an awakened too. But in this ancient past, the gods were still alive, and so were the demons. Their terrible war had not started yet, and Weaver had not disappeared to create something that would spell doom for both the 6 gods and the 6 demons. To create the nightmare spell. If Sunny's suspicions were correct, of course. That meant the nightmare spell had not even existed yet in this era, but awakened did, as well as nightmare creatures, or the corrupted as the youth had called them. Sunny's vertical pupils narrowed. Were the nightmare creatures not created by the nightmare spell as well? Sunny muttered, "What the hell?" The very idea seemed strange and ridiculous. The spell had appeared in the waking world, causing the first nightmare creatures to be made from the bodies of those infected by it, and for the first generation of the awakened to be born. It summoned those awakened into the dream realm, which was populated by the abominations, and pushed them toward seeking out and challenging the seeds of nightmares. Unless a seed was conquered, it eventually opened a path for more monsters to enter reality. The very idea of nightmare creatures, aspects, and awakened was inseparable from the spell, and yet, somehow it was. Sunny stammered, "What? What does it all mean?" Sunny ground his fangs, overwhelmed by a myriad of thoughts, and a lot of confusion. It seemed as though the very foundation of his worldview had suddenly turned out to be built on shifting sand. He closed his eyes and scowled, feeling a dull headache approaching, then raised 2 hands and rubbed his face, careful not to slice it open with the claws. Suddenly, the cage next to his swayed. The young awakened stood up and grabbed the bars, staring into the darkness. A few moments later, he said hoarsely,
Demons, hey demons, wake up, they're coming.
"Glory, glory, glory." Sunny growled, falling to the ground, the heavy body of a stone gargoyle pressing him down, its claws buried in his chest. A dark radiance rose from his skin, the scales of a coiling serpent becoming more visible, and then one of the forearms of the abomination shattered, pulled apart by his hands. The creature roared, its tail shooting forward like a spear. He had no time to dodge or deflect the blow, so instead, Sonny simply endured the blinding pain of the stone spike piercing his shoulder, and pushed with his feet, straining to jump up. As the result, his horn struck the gargoyle in the chin, impaling it through the skull. Something cold streamed down his face, and momentarily blinded, Sonny struck the abomination in the chest with all his might, sending the stone Goliath flying back. The gargoyle exploded into a rain of stone shards when its body struck the floor of the arena. Sonny breathed heavily, his torso a mess of torn flesh, and then tiredly searched for the remaining enemy, which was supposed to be fighting the awakened youth, if he was still alive. His second day in the Colosseum had been both easier and more harrowing than the first. It was easier because Sonny was slowly growing accustomed to his new inhuman body. For someone else, this process might have taken longer, but he had always put adaptability and control of his physicality first. Both the flowing battle-style Nephis had taught him and shadow dance were meant to make the practitioner as flexible and versatile as possible, the latter especially being the pinnacle of malleability. So, he had plenty of practice to prepare himself for waking up in the body of an actual demon. Ironically, who would have thought? But this day's battles were also much more lethal. At first, Sonny had thought that his luck was just this bad, but after he and the young awakened had barely survived the first 2 boxes, the youth shared a bit of knowledge that put everything into perspective. Apparently, by surviving the previous day's slaughter and making their way to the center of the arena, the 2 of them earned the privilege of being added to the main herd of gladiators. In other words, everyone and everything they faced today had won 7 consecutive fights in the past as well. This was the cream of the crop of the enslaved combatants, more or less, and the final stage was also going to be different. Sonny spat, "Damnation." He sensed 2 swift shadows some distance away, then finally saw them. His eyesight wasn't the best in daylight, so Sonny relied on shadow sense more and more. The kid was still alive, wielding a simple sword and a rusty shield that he had picked up in their second fight. He was dancing around the gargoyle, showing a good grasp of combat technique and more than a little bit of talent. The young man was inexperienced but incredibly talented. His battle prowess was perhaps on par with what Sonny himself had shown on the Forgotten Shore, or even greater. Not that it was going to help the youth. What was the point of knowing how to wield a sword when that sword had no chance of piercing the enemy's stone skin?
Demon, I can't hold it off much longer.
Sonny sighed, then stepped through the shadows, appearing behind the gargoyle in a whirlwind of claws. With a loud roar, he crashed into the towering creature and caught it in a deadly embrace. The steel cables of his muscles moved under the obsidian skin, and with a low growl, Sonny lifted the heavy abomination into the air. Sonny grunted, "Gods, is this how much Saint weighs?" Even for his demonic body, the burden of a monster of similar proportions, made entirely out of stone, was almost too much. Almost. Without stopping his lunge, Sonny carried the gargoyle forward like a speeding train and smashed the creature against the spikes mounted on the wall, impaling it on them. The crowd roared, expressing their joy and admiration of his brutality. Sonny watched as mad light was extinguished in the eyes of the abomination, then took a step back and fell heavily to one knee. Sonny growled, Can you shut up for a moment? You bastards." Today, he hated the spectators even more than he had yesterday. The awakened youth was already beside him, staring at the dead gargoyle with a dark expression. Then he glanced at his sword, and finally at the 4-armed monstrosity near him.
Demon youth, you don't look too well.
Sonny looked at him with his black eyes, no recognizable human expression on his strange, bestial face. Sonny retorted, "No way you noticed. Damn, what a fool." Sonny, indeed, did not look too well. In fact, he looked terrible, with his obsidian skin torn in many places and sliced muscle tissue visible beneath. The most disturbing thing about it was the fact that his mangled flesh was awash with crimson blood, but none of it flowed out of the wounds, as if possessing a will of its own. He had not fared as well as he had thought he would in the battle against the gargoyles. in large part because the monsters had turned out to be much more powerful and swift than the similar creatures he had fought before. In the future, although Sunny was reluctant to do so, he suspected that he would have to reveal at least one of his two hidden cards, the Soul Serpent or Saint, before too long. The youth hesitated for a few moments, then suddenly stepped forward and put his hand on Sunny's torn chest. Sunny hissed, shocked by the unexpected gesture.
Don't move, demon. I'm trying to help you.
What the hell?
Suddenly, the young man's light blue eyes shone with cerulean light, and his curly blonde hair moved as though brushed by an otherworldly wind. A warm sensation spread from his palm into Sunny's aching body. Slowly, the pain receded, and at the same time, the torn fibers of his flesh started to repair themselves, growing back together. In a dozen seconds or so, miraculously, the terrible wounds on his body had almost closed. The young man, however, paled considerably and stepped back. His breathing fast and ragged, it seemed as though his soul essence was largely drained. Sunny breathed, "Well, I'll be damned." The fool was a healer. Sunny couldn't know whether to laugh or cry. On one hand, awakened healers were incredibly rare, and having one as his only ally was of tremendous benefit. On the other hand, his only ally in the battle arena also turned out to possess an aspect that was absolutely useless in a fight. So there was that as well. The iron gates rattled, opening the path to the next killing box. Sunny hesitated for a few moments and then rose to his feet. Sunny muttered, "No, this is good. I can kill anything the slavers throw at us. He just has to keep me alive." He glanced at the pale youth, then nodded curtly and headed toward the gates. Before walking through them, however, he stopped and tore off the long tip of the dead gargoyle's tail, then handed it to the young man. The stone spike of an awakened nightmare creature was bound to perform better than a mundane weapon at least. The awakened stared at him for a bit, then sighed and dropped the sword onto the ground. They walked through the gate and Sunny's face instantly darkened. Sunny muttered, "I know that smell." The chain worm he had seen before in the dungeon was already crawling through the other gate, its terrifying maw dripping with black blood. The crowd began its chant again, ecstatic to see the fallen demon advance to the next box. "Glory! Glory!" He sighed, full of dread and hatred. Sunny growled, all right, bastards, I'll show you glory." Sunny tore the chain worm apart, pieces of flesh and puddles of blood covering the red stones of the arena like a ghastly carpet. Then, shrouded in impenetrable shadows, he thrust his hands into the mangled carcass of the slain abomination and ripped 3 bloody soul shards out. Ironically, killing the fallen demon had not been too hard for him. A long time ago, Master Roan had described these vile creatures as incredibly formidable and deadly opponents. Someone that even he would not have wanted to face alone. But that was because Master Roan was a human. Chain worms fed on metal, and as such, steel weapons and armor were useless against them. Sunny would have been in trouble if he was still in his human body, and most of his arsenal of memories suddenly became ineffective. However, he was a demon now, one of the shadow spawn or shadow's kin, or whatever it was he had been turned into. His claws, his fangs. And his shadows were the perfect weapon to destroy such abominations. Of course, fighting against a creature one rank higher than him was not easy, but augmented by 3 shadows, he had managed to dismantle the massive abomination without too much trouble. In fact, killing the chain worm had been much easier than killing Master Pierce. He wasn't even wounded, at least not seriously. The crowd grew silent, shocked by his display of ruthless brutality, and then exploded with cheers. Glory, glory. It seemed that they enjoyed seeing someone triumph against a stronger opponent much more than anything else. Sunny muttered, "Crazy bastards." Sunny glanced at the spectators with resentment, then walked over to the young awakened and pushed the soul shards into his hands. The youth looked at them with a frown.
These are these soul shards.
Gods, how can he be an awakened and not know what a shard looks like?
Sunny stared at the young man darkly, then nodded and raised one hand to his chest, making a fist. The awakened hesitated.
Don't you want to consume them yourself?
Sunny snarled, then shook his head. Finally convinced, the youth crushed the shards in his fists and froze, a funny expression appearing on his face.
What a strange failing.
Whatever. Sonny wasn't giving the shards away out of altruism. For better or worse, the young man was now his partner. The stronger he became, the better he would be able to aid Sonny, both in battle and while using his healing aspect. And Sonny was going to need a lot of healing. That he was sure of. After that was done, they proceeded to the 5th cage and then to the 6th, and finally to the last. By that point, Sonny was nearing his limit. Both battles after the chain worm had tested him in ways he had not expected, draining him of essence, damaging his body, and putting a heavy strain on his endurance. He was exhausted and overwhelmed by pain, the merciless sun shining blindingly in the blue skies and making his black eyes ache. At least the crushing seemed to ignore the island where the Colosseum was located. In fact, Sonny had not felt the island move either up or down even once. Perhaps it had a permanent altitude. Like the sanctuary of Noctis, the 7th battle, the last one they had to survive today, was indeed different. The central stage of the arena was circular in shape with 6 gates in its walls. 4 were already opened and 2 still stood closed. Corpses of several terrifying creatures were laying on the red stones, steam rising from the pools of blood surrounding them. And in the middle of the killing stage, 2 humans stood, their faces hidden behind the helmet visors. Both were tall, strong and clad in archaic armor. Their garments were painted bright red, and so were the plumes of their helmets. One was armed with a spear and a shield, while the other wielded an axe and a sword. These were worshippers of war god, just like the spectators singing from the stone seats of the great amphitheater. The young man shivered.
Warmongers, these mad dogs.
Sonny tilted his head, paying no attention to the raging crowd as he studied the 2 humans. Both were awakened, and from the look of it, of sufficient power and skill. They were calm and solemn, their eyes empty of even a hint of fear and instead full of confidence and savage joy. Glory. That was what all of them were here for, willingly or not. The masters of the arena wanted their slaves to fight for it, but they also wanted to achieve it themselves. After the initial culling had taken place, the final obstacle the gladiators had to overcome each day was to kill some of their slavers, and the slavers had to survive the onslaught of the slaves if they wished to live. In fact, all of the battles in the arena served a singular purpose: to deliver the best and the most formidable opponents for the worshippers of war to temper themselves against or die trying. Sonny agreed. Mad dogs indeed. All these people were insane. Sonny was now more sure of it than ever. It didn't change anything, though. He still had to kill the 2 awakened warriors if he wanted to survive, or rather, if he wanted to earn the chance to be killed in the arena some other day. With a low growl, Sonny sent one of the shadows to the ground. In this fight, being aware of his surroundings was going to be more important than raw strength. No awakened human could challenge him in terms of raw might after all, unless their aspect was solely focused on it. But such an aspect was the least dangerous an enemy of his could possess. It was easy to understand and predictable, at least. It was the versatility and unpredictable nature of aspects that made awakened so dangerous. Without much fanfare, the 4 of them lunged at each other, an almost palpable killing intent permeating the arena. The 2 warriors fought with tremendous skill and combat prowess. The 2 warriors fought bravely and furiously, moving like 2 parts of a single organism. The 2 warriors fought with incredible insight and cunning, both wielding clarity like a deadly weapon. Truly, they were worthy of being the followers of war. But in the end, both of them died. How could they resist a creature that could turn their skill against them, who had faced terrors so vast that most humans would have been driven mad by a mere glimpse of them, and who lived his life wearing countless lies like a mantle? Sonny watched as the corpse of the 2nd human fell to the ground, awash in blood, light dimming in his unbelieving eyes, and sighed. Sonny murmured, "Here's your glory, poor fools. How does it taste? Is it sweet? Is it bitter? Or does it taste like nothing at all, like the empty lie that it is?" Turning away from the dead men, he glanced at the crowd, expecting to finally see sorrow and displeasure on the faces of the spectators. He had just killed two of their own after all, but his hopes were instantly crushed. The people gathered in the amphitheater were not at all perturbed by the death of their brethren. Instead, they were even more excited, pride and joy gleaming on their faces. Laughing and smiling, they pointed at him and yelled one word, other and other. Only this time. It was a new one. All of them were shouting, "Shadow! Shadow, shadow, shadow!" Sonny swayed, looking at the broken sword in his hand. When did it break? He didn't quite remember. This was one of the first weapons he had picked up in the arena right after killing. Wait, who had he killed for that sword? Dead faces spun in his mind, staring at him with empty eyes. There were so many that he couldn't even tell whether all of them had once belonged to real enemies or were simply created by his imagination. No, that one was real. The first human he had killed in the Colosseum. That had been the battle where he took the sword. These days he was having trouble remembering things. Sonny threw the broken sword away and looked at the crowd that was chanting his name. Shadow. Right. That was him. Sonny muttered, "What is wrong with you, fool? Since when was that your name?" He growled, wishing that he had thrown the broken weapon at one of the humans. Not that it would have done any good. There were powerful enchantments permeating the ancient stones of the Colosseum. Some of them were meant to prevent the fighters from escaping. Others protected the audience from their ire. Some he had no idea about. All his attempts to break free of this cursed place had failed. For now.
Demons, are you all right?
Sonny lingered for a few moments, then glanced at Elyas, slowly returning from the bizarre state of mind the battle had sent him into. The young man was looking at him with a strange expression on his face, a bit of apprehension hiding deep in his light blue eyes. The youth had grown considerably stronger in the weeks they had spent fighting all kinds of monsters, both of the nightmare and humankind. In the arena, all those soul shards had not been wasted on him. His healing ability was now much more potent, and his skill as a warrior blossomed. His face also changed, becoming gaunt and angular, almost mature. One had no choice but to grow up quickly in hell. The pain of the flaw washed over Sonny, finally shattering his strange trance. He gritted his teeth and nodded.
Well, good. You are being weird recently, you know. I have some essence left, so let me heal you before they take us back to the cages.
Sonny allowed the youth to approach and activate his aspect ability, staring at the warmonger they had just killed. This one was a bit of a challenge. The bastard had almost taken one of his arms off. The slavers they fought were growing stronger lately. Sonny muttered, "Something is wrong." Sonny was not thinking about the warmongers. He was thinking about his own state. At the start of all this, he had been in very bad shape. Day after day, he had fought in the arena, receiving terrible wounds and being beaten down time after time, just to claw his way to survival somehow and be thrown back into the cage. At first, he had kept his spirits high despite all the horror of his situation. He kept thinking and studying his surroundings, searching for a way to escape. He still had hope, but after a while, when nothing had worked, the weight of pain, torment, and hopelessness had grown heavier and heavier, and then heavier still. A seed of despair had taken root in his soul, and once there, it grew uncontrollably, threatening to break him into pieces. Sonny had not broken, but he had to search for a way to survive in the arena without losing pieces of his flesh each time, to bide his time until an opportunity to escape presented itself. He had found that way in Shadow Dance. The idea had been kept in the depths of his mind for a long time, but only now, faced with this soul-crushing despair, had Sonny summoned it into the light. He had decided to try and expand the purview of his battle style to include not only shadowing humans, but also nightmare creatures. The result was a resounding success, armed with a demon's body. Sonny had found it surprisingly easy to peer into the very essence of how the mad abominations carried themselves in battle, how they used their monstrous bodies and vile abilities to tear, ravage, and obliterate everything in their path. And then he had stolen it. He had claws too. He had fangs and horns too. He had plenty of hatred and cruelty burning in his heart too. Not that having a demon's body mattered in the end. It was the willingness to shift the way he thought that was needed. Why couldn't he learn how to ravage, rip apart, and obliterate from these creatures. He had done exactly that, and slowly, his performance in the arena started to improve. Being able to shadow the nightmare creatures not only enhanced his battle style, but also made them more predictable and thus less dangerous. Of course, the task had not been easy. In fact, understanding how the corrupted fought and what impulses guided them was, in a sense, much harder than deciphering even the most sophisticated battle style. Their minds were perverted, bizarre, and alien to everything he had ever known. And yet, he had nothing else to do but practice as though his life depended on it, because it quite literally did, and eventually his efforts bore fruit. Sonny couldn't quite remember when he had made a breakthrough, but at some point, he found himself being able to understand the nightmare creatures much better. From that point onward, his mastery of shadow dance, which had been stagnating since the Dreamscape tournament, finally started advancing once again, and with frightening speed. Now, Sonny was able to use shadow dance to assume the shape and form of all his enemies, at least in his mind, and thus know how they were going to try and destroy him. By knowing that, he had been able to anticipate and kill them first, instead, one after another, day after day, week after week. And here he was, barely remembering who he was. As Elyas healed his wounds, Sonny stared at the dead Warmonger, his scowl growing deeper and deeper. Sonny whispered, "Am I becoming a nightmare creature?" The thought sent a cold shiver running down his spine. How did one become corrupted, anyway? Sometime later, back in the cage, Sonny stared into the darkness, scared. This was not a danger he had anticipated. Thrust into the terrible meat grinder of the arena, he had been so focused on surviving the terrifying battles that the possibility of having his very self annihilated, piece by little piece, had never occurred to him. What exactly was happening to him? Sonny stared at the unbreakable bars of his cage and shuddered. Sonny muttered, "Damn, I really need to get out of here." But how? He had been trying to escape all this time, with not even a hint of a chance. The damned collar around his neck made sure that he would never be able to leave the Colosseum. His black eyes narrowed. Sonny muttered, No, I have to hold on just a little longer. This madness is not going to last forever." It simply couldn't. Half of the cages in the dungeon were already empty, their inhabitants slaughtered on the red stones of the arena. The Warmongers were slowly running out of slaves to kill. And when their number decreased too much, with only the most ferocious and deadly monsters left, something was bound to happen, wasn't it? A cold feeling of despair drowned his mind. Sonny whispered, "But what if it doesn't?" After a while, shrouded in darkness, Elyas suddenly spoke, addressing Sonny in his usual one-sided manner. In the past weeks, the young awakened had developed a habit of sometimes speaking to his demonic partner, even though the frightening creature could not respond with anything more than an occasional nod, a shake of the head, or an indifferent shrug. Talking to Shadow was not much of a conversation, but perhaps this was one of the few things that were keeping him sane. Sonny could understand why the youth had to do that, since his own inability to talk was one of the things that were driving him mad, that was robbing him of even more of his humanity.
Hey, Diamond, do you think it's true about the wooden sword?
Sonny stared at the young man, then shrugged. He had no opinion on that topic, since he didn't know what the wooden sword was. Elyas sighed.
Before the Warmongers captured us, I had heard of their cruel trials. Everyone back home has, really. The horrors of the Red Colosseum is something every parent tells their children to make them behave.
He grew silent, and then continued after some time, his voice even.
But they also say that there is a way to escape this terrible place. If one is brave enough, if they are righteous enough, then they would eventually be given a wooden sword and earn the right to fight for their freedom.
Sonny shifted slightly, tilting his head. Sonny muttered, "What a nice fairy tale." The poor kid was deceiving himself if he thought that the worshippers of war were going to just let them go. Bravery, righteousness. These concepts were alien to the insane zealots. Or rather, they understood it all differently. Sunny had spent enough time observing the warriors, or warmongers as Elyas called them, to understand that they were not evil people, or at least did not consider themselves as such. Their worldview was twisted and ruthlessly cruel, but more or less simple. They believed in struggle and glory. One had to struggle to achieve glory, and the struggle itself was the most glorious thing. That was why they were happy and joyful when watching their new favorite, Shadow, slaughter his way through the arena no matter who or what he was killing. Nightmare creatures or their own friends and family. Because dying while struggling against an overwhelming foe was the highest form of glory. Dying by his hand was a privilege and an expression of virtue. The only thing more righteous than being killed by a stronger enemy was to kill that enemy instead. In their mind, the warriors saw what they were doing to the slaves not as a cruel injustice, but as a benevolent gift. The slaves were not forced to slaughter each other for the entertainment of the crowd. Instead, they were generously given a chance to walk the path of righteousness and strive toward glory. That was why Sunny didn't think that any of the slaves would ever be allowed to walk free of the Colosseum. Doing so would be the greatest sin, a shameful offense that the warmongers in their perverse benevolence would never visit upon their prisoners. To them, that would have been the vilest form of cruelty. Sunny breathed a quiet curse, damned lunatics. Sunny was not sure that all followers of War God were this bizarre. In fact, he was pretty certain that this murderous sect had been born here, in the Kingdom of Hope. The slavers he had met in the first nightmare worshipped the same God, but were nothing like these battle-sworn zealots. The Kingdom of Hope was a very strange place throughout, from what little he had gathered from Elyas' words. Sunny now knew that he had been sent into a time period around 1,000 years after the destruction of the real kingdom by Sun God. Now, only the name remained. People inhabiting these lands did not even know who the demon of desire was, really, only that she had been punished by the gods and imprisoned in the ivory tower, and that their duty was to guard her prison. In this duty, the people of the kingdom were led by 7 lords, or rather 5, since 2 had already perished. The ivory tower itself had not been separated from the rest of the isles yet, and remained at the center of the region, surrounded by a large city, the beautiful city of aerial bridges and white aqueducts that he had seen rebuild itself from ashes at the start of the nightmare, Elyas' home. The ivory city was populated by the followers of Sun God, and protected by 2 of the remaining 5 lords. The west of the region belonged to the second most populous faction of the Kingdom of Hope, the followers of War, and this was where Sunny had the misfortune to find himself. He had seen the statues of War God here and there in the arena, even though they did not resemble the one he had witnessed on the strange island that a circular river flowed through. These statues of the God of War, as well as of life, progress, technology, craft, intellect, and humanity, all depicted him as a mighty warrior in heavy armor, wielding a bloodied spear and a cracked shield. The warriors were also led by one of the lords, a beautiful priestess of war whose name was Solving. The dazzling beauty was one of the rulers of the Kingdom of Hope. The followers of War God and Sun God seemed to be in conflict with each other, and so were the lords leading them. That was how Elyas and his family had ended up captured and brought into the arena to serve as slaves fighting in the trials. The remaining 2 lords were neutral and of no consequence, since their factions were much smaller and wielded no real power. One resided far to the north, and the other somewhere in the east. Elyas did not know much about them, and so Sunny didn't either. He just knew that the 5 lords were, without a doubt, the eternal shackles mentioned in the description of the undying chain, immortal jailers created by Sun God to keep Hope imprisoned in her tower chained forever. What had once been a suspicion of his now turned into a certainty. There were just too many clues, some of which he had collected before venturing into the seed, and some that he had picked up from the young man's words, and maybe, just maybe, that knowledge could help him gain freedom.
Wooden sword fight for their freedom.
Sunny shifted slightly, causing his cage to sway, and glanced at Elyas. The youth was not in a talking mood anymore and just sat quietly, staring into the darkness. There was something, a hint of a meaning in what he had said. Sunny tried desperately to catch that meaning, but for some reason his thoughts kept returning to the statues of War God. He had seen two depictions of the fearsome deity in the Kingdom of Hope. One was a warrior in heavy armor, wielding a bloodied spear and a cracked shield, both presumably representing warfare and battle, and the other was a woman wearing nothing but a beast hide around her waist, holding a spear in one hand and a beating human heart in another. The spear representing her dominion over war, technology, and craft, perhaps, the heart representing her connection to life and humanity. Why were these statues so different? Sunny was still exhausted after the furious battles of the past day, his thoughts slow and feverish as they often were these days. Frustrated, he rubbed his face, then scratched at it with sharp claws, slicing the skin apart. The pain washed the fog shrouding his mind away, allowing him to think clearly for a few minutes. The altar of war. That was what Xavileiro had called the island where the primeval statue of the goddess of life stood. And that was the right word. This depiction of the deity seemed much more primal, bestial, ancient. The statue itself seemed incredibly ancient too, much older than the statues of the mighty warrior were. In fact, it seemed as ancient as the Red Colosseum itself, or perhaps even older, old enough to have been created before the Kingdom of Hope was shattered and turned into the chain of floating islands by Sun God, as it was today and would be thousands of years into the future. Why would Hope have a monument to one of the gods in her domain? Well, the idea itself was not that strange. Gods and demons had not been always at war after all. In fact, the prince of the underworld had a shrine to the goddess of the black skies, Storm God, in his very tower, despite the fact that later she would become his mortal enemy. So that question was not important. The important thing was that Sunny couldn't stop thinking about the statue for some reason. Sunny murmured. As ancient as the Red Colosseum itself. Suddenly, Sunny tilted his head. Sunny let out a sharp gasp of realization. The white amphitheater and the arena it surrounded were the derelict of the true Kingdom of Hope as well. He had realized that fact a while back, partially from how they looked, and partially from how deep and ancient some of the shadows hiding in the corners of the dungeon felt. In fact, Sunny suspected that the theater had not always been a battle arena. It reminded him of the giant quarry at the roots of the Hollow Mountains, where the 7 heroes of the Forgotten Shore had excavated stone to build the mighty walls of their city and the Crimson Spire itself. Ivory City had to have been built out of something too. So this place must have been a similar quarry once and had served as the source of the white stones used to construct those aerial bridges and aqueducts. Later, it had been turned into a theater, and later still. The Warmongers usurped that theater and made it into an arena, soaking the ancient stones with so much blood that they turned red. His black eyes narrowed. Sunny whispered, "This is it. This must be it." All this time, Sunny had been tormented by one paradoxical question. A question that was of utmost importance for his attempts to gain freedom. If this was an era where the nightmare spell did not exist yet, then how could Xavileiro put him on a leash capable of severing his connection to the spell? The collar was a simple piece of enchanted metal, with no lock or any other way of opening it. It was almost impossible to damage or destroy, but the enchantment itself was not very complicated. Sunny could feel that it wasn't. What it did, however, was tie him to the vast and incredibly powerful enchantments of the arena itself. Those enchantments were harnessed by the Warmongers to maintain the cages, prevent the slaves from escaping by any means, mundane or magical, and ensure that they behaved while being transported to and, very rarely, back from the arena. His inability to connect to the spell almost seemed like a side effect of these measures. But what could even interfere with the spell, let alone accidentally? And now he felt as if he had found the answer. If the Red Colosseum was indeed not built by the warriors but only usurped by them, then it was indeed very clear. Sorcery of another demon could. If the demon of desire was the original creator of the theater, then the enchantments left behind by her would probably do the job of messing with the spell weaved from the strings of fate by her older sibling. Sunny shifted, grasping the bars of the cage. Suddenly, a powerful emotion burst in his chest, filling his muscles with renewed strength and his mind with desperate resolve. Hope, it was hope. He didn't think of it as poison anymore. No, it was the opposite, a most powerful antidote. If the spell had been created by weather, and the enchantments interfering with it created by hope. If all of this was the result of a clash between two types of demonic sorcery, then why couldn't he, as an inheritor of a demonic legacy, do something to resolve that clash? Sure, Sunny knew nothing about weaving magic, but he had also not known anything about combat once, or how to live and fight in a body of an actual demon. If there was one thing he was good at, it was learning new things. Well, that and lying, and staying alive. Staring at the ghastly dungeon surrounding him with new eyes, Sunny studied its ancient stone walls and frowned. So, how was one supposed to start learning sorcery? There were hours left until they were going to be taken to the arena again. Sunny stared at the walls of the dungeon intently, as though hoping to glean some secrets from the ancient stones. But what could he see? They were just old stones. There was nothing interesting on their surface, and neither was there anything interesting beneath it. After a while, Sunny took a deep breath and sat down again, trying to make himself as comfortable as possible in the narrow cage. Then he shut down his senses. Pushing away the presence of countless abominations surrounding him, the stench of the prison, the pain in his exhausted body, everything that distracted him from thinking, Sunny asked himself, "What do I know about sorcery?" That was a daunting question. Even the word itself was deceptive. Humans of his world used it to describe any aspect capable of dealing direct damage to the opponents, as opposed to augmenting the Awakened's combat ability, especially those that could do so from range. But that wasn't what Sunny was after. No, what he was interested in was not the type of abilities that existed within the familiar framework of supernatural powers, but the very means used to create that framework. Or at least those that existed outside the realm of aspects. That, to him, was true sorcery, Sunny mused, but there are different kinds of such sorcery as well. What are the ones that I've witnessed? 3 came to mind. The first one he was familiar with the best, the spellweave, which he believed to be Weaver's own sorcery. The spell itself was created from it, as well as all the magical items that the spell gifted to the Awakened, memories and echoes. This was the magic that all humans knew and most believed to be the only kind there is. Sunny, however, had already learned that sorcery was not synonymous with the spell and that there were ways of creating magic different from spellweave. The first of them he had witnessed inside the Echo of Saint, which had remnants of a much more primitive weave hiding beneath the usual pattern of ethereal strings before he turned her into a shadow. Later, he encountered the same type of alien weave within the walls of the Ebony Tower. This type of sorcery belonged to the Prince of the Underworld, Weaver's younger sibling. The similarity between them was hard not to notice, but Sunny didn't know which of the demons had copied which. Whether Weaver perfected the sorcery created by their brother, or whether the youngest child of the unknown had based the method of his craft on the eldest's invention. Judging by these two types of sorcery, it was easy to imagine that all of them involved some kind of a weave. However, that conclusion would have been wrong. Sunny knew this because of the third type of magic he had encountered, the miraculous creation of Sun God. The obsidian knife he had taken from the white altar of the sanctuary of Noctis before leaving for the Night Temple, and was now resting, inaccessible, on the bottom of the covetous coffer. The black knife had no weave hiding beneath its surface. Instead, it was full of blinding radiance, as though encompassing a boundless ocean of soul essence, with a single string of fate placed in the pristine light as it folded on itself endlessly and formed a never-ending circle. That was the sorcery of Sun God. If a deific miracle could even be called sorcery, in any case, the obsidian knife, and later, the wooden one he had used to kill Solving, proved that one didn't have to base their magic on a weave of some sort. This was just the unique way Weaver cast his and their brother followed. So, Hope's sorcery might have been completely unique too. Trapped in the iron cage, Sunny frowned. How was he supposed to search for something that could have looked like anything? Come to think of it, there was another type of sorcery that he had encountered, or rather, several different ones, all united by the same method of creation, runic magic. The first time he had seen it was underneath the ruined cathedral of the Dark City, in a small cell where a corpse-wearing weaver's mask had been chained within a broken circle. That circle was carved into the stone floor, surrounded by countless symbols that Sunny had not recognized. The gateway within the Crimson Spire was surrounded by a circle of runes too, as well as the stone arch on the last level of the Ebony Tower and the one connected to it, situated in the beautiful white gazebo on the Ivory Island. Another place where he had encountered sorceress runes was the Night Temple. There, they had been either inscribed by someone from Clan Valor or at least found and repurposed by them. So basically, he was familiar with three general types of creating sorcery. One was the spellweave, as well as a version of it used by the Prince of the Underworld. The other was the divine miracles of Sun God, which he couldn't even begin to understand. And the last one was based on the inscription of runes and seemed to have been mostly used by humans. Here in the Kingdom of Hope and on the neighboring Forgotten Shore, Sunny let out a slow breath, thinking. There was a small discrepancy, however. Sunny wondered. Why was the portal in the Ebony Tower created with runic magic instead of the primitive spellweave, like everything else in there? Was it, perhaps, because the connecting portal on the Ivory Island had been? The Prince of the Underworld had built the tower in the sky below long after Hope had built hers after all. In fact, he had done so after his sister was already imprisoned, to harvest the divine flames that had destroyed her domain. It would have made sense for him to use runic magic to invade an already existing system of portals that had been based on it. So, was Hope, perhaps, the source of runic magic? Or at least a user of it? Sunny sighed, feeling spent and tired, then closed his eyes. He had to sleep at least a little to allow his body and mind some rest before tomorrow's battles, especially now that he had not only to survive them, but also do so while searching for any sign of hidden runes throughout the arena. A new day brought with it a new portion of pain, hardship, and despair. Sunny and Elyas were dragged into the arena, the same ascended Warmonger guiding them by the chains attached to the collars. Sunny stumbled forward, his gaze locked on the man's broad back. The jailer was incredibly tall for a human, his height more than even that of the shadow demon Sunny was currently inhabiting. His figure was solemn and powerful, a sense of terrifying strength radiating from it in almost physical waves. The Apostle of War wore the same ragged leather armor and a tattered red robe, his features hidden behind a deep hood. In all these weeks, Sunny had never seen his face or heard him speak. The great blade on the ascended warrior's back looked special too. It was definitely enchanted with very powerful magic. Now that Sunny turned his thoughts to the nature of sorcery, he was silently studying the line of runes inscribed along the edge of the heavy weapon. Sunny muttered, "Runic magic again." That made sense. How else were these ancient people supposed to enchant their weapons? It was not like they could rely on memories and spellweave. That said, magical weapons seemed to be much rarer in the Kingdom of Hope than in the waking world. Most of the awakened Sunny had fought in the arena, wielded either mundane ones or those possessing weak, primitive enchantments. It was the far cry from the powerful memories he was used to, although Sunny did not know if that was the nature of this era, or just another sign of the ubiquitous regression that seemed to reign in what remained of the Kingdom of Hope. Everything here seemed devolved, worn out, and on the verge of falling apart. The whole region was obviously in decline, and had been for some time now. While studying the runes on the Great Blade, he also noticed that it had a few new nicks. The leather armor of the silent giant had more scratches than before as well. It seemed that the Ascended was participating in the battles in the arena himself. Sunny muttered grimly, "I guess I'll have to fight that monster too, eventually." Finally, a rusty iron gate appeared in front of them, blinding sunlight streaming through its bars. The rumbling voices of the crowd echoed from the stone walls, washing over him like a cursed tide. The gate swung open, and the chains came off of their collars. Sunny and Elyas entered the first killing box and watched as their opponents crawled out of a similar tunnel. The young awakened brandished his weapon, a short spear fashioned out of a long, twisting horn, and forced out a weak smile.
Luck is on our side today, demon. These creatures are called burrowers. On solid stone, their main advantage is gone. Just don't let them swallow you.
Sunny snarled, then dashed forward with a roar. Hard. Today was going to be hard. He was forced to use shadow dance to peer into the souls of the nightmare creatures, despite suspecting that doing so too much threatened to destroy his already unsteady mind. He also had to both concentrate on the fight and thoroughly study the ancient theater in hopes of discovering signs of Hope's sorcery. It was almost like his first training sessions with Saint, when he had to resist the taciturn monster while simultaneously keeping an eye on his shadow to decipher the secret of its dance. The problem was that, back then, he had ended up beaten black and blue by Saint most of the time. Now, he couldn't allow himself to lose. Sunny descended upon the repulsive burrowers, which looked like sacks of bulbous flesh with giant circular maws gaping in them, and tried to slaughter the abominations without being eaten alive. The first fight came and went, and then it was time for the second one, and then the third one, and then the fourth. Sunny had slain the vicious burrowers, and then a creature that resembled a giant walking skeleton, its bones green and as tough as granite, and then a swarm of monstrous ants that covered the floor of the arena like a carpet, and then a being that was like an oozing mountain of mire sludge that had long, razor-sharp steel sickles protruding from it. His body was torn and sliced and crushed and gnawed on. Elyas had healed the most terrible wounds, but the rest remained, not worthy of having precious soul essence wasted on them yet. Sunny was once again overwhelmed by pain, rage, and the desperate need to fight for his survival. Everything else disappeared. The only thing that remained was battle, blood, and murder, and fear. However, today that wasn't enough. He fought through the battle fog that encompassed his mind and kept searching, studying every corner of the red Colosseum. The floor of the arena, the walls surrounding it, the rows of seats rising above, in search of intricately engraved runes. But all he saw were the statues of war god, the jubilant faces of the spectators, and the weathered surface of ancient stones. There was no hint of any engravings anywhere. Sunny whispered, "Where are you? Where?" The fifth battle almost cost him his life. While fighting against a familiar foe, a giant worm-like creature that possessed a seemingly endless reserve of vitality, Sunny had tripped on the uneven surface of the floor of the arena, lost his balance, and tumbled down. If not for Elyas, who fearlessly jumped forward and pulled the attention of the terrible abomination to himself, he would have been viciously mauled or even lost his life. Back when Sunny had fought a worm like that the first time, the creature eventually succumbed to the soul damage continuously dealt to it by the cruel sight. Today, however, he had no deadly memory to help him, only his claws, his fangs, and his horns. In the end, Sunny had to literally rip the giant abomination to shreds. Only when its body was torn apart completely did the worm stop regenerating new flesh and recovering from all the wounds and finally died. Exhausted, Sunny fell to his knees and breathed hoarsely, then threw a hateful glance at the crowd chanting his name. Finally, he lowered his head and glared at the wide groove in the red stone of the arena that had almost cost him his life. There were several grooves like that in some of the killing boxes, cutting through the floor of the Colosseum like broad channels meant for the rivers of blood to flow through them. Usually, he took note of their placement in advance to avoid losing his footing at a dire moment. But today, with his attention split between the battles and the need to study the arena, Sunny had failed in that regard. Sunny cursed the uneven ground. Damn thing, why couldn't they just make the arena flat? Well, the answer was obvious. All that blood had to go somewhere, and if not for these grooves, the whole Colosseum would have slowly turned into one giant crimson pool. He frowned. Sunny muttered, "Wait, that doesn't make sense, though." Sunny lingered, noticing that the gate to the sixth box was already opening. The grooves were as ancient as the red Colosseum itself, which meant that they had been here long before the Warmongers started holding their demented trials here. Long before the name Red Colosseum was even given to it, which meant that these grooves had been cut through the stone back when it had still been pristine white and had no blood spilled on it. So, serving as channels that took away blood could not have been their purpose. Sunny's lightless eyes narrowed. Suddenly, he realized his mistake. All this time, he had been looking for the sorceress runes while expecting them to look like they had the previous times he encountered them. Intricate, small, and numerous, arranged into shapes and patterns, and yet he had found nothing. But in fact, the runes were right in front of him the whole time, or rather beneath his feet. He was just too small and insignificant to notice them, like an ant crawling across a vast painting and failing to see the whole image for what it was. There were no circles of intricate runes carved anywhere in the Colosseum. Instead, the whole vastness of the ancient arena was a runic circle, a canvas Hope had used to create her sorcery. He was standing on it. The runes Hope had used were not small, intricate, and elaborate. Instead, they were giant, spanning the whole width of the blood-soaked arena, and guided torrential floods of soul energy instead of thin streams of it to create the unimaginably powerful enchantments. Once Sunny knew where to look, it didn't take him long to start noticing a pattern and meaning in the placement and direction of the grooves cut in the ancient stone. The problem was, their scope was too great to be perceived from the floor of the arena. He would have been able to see the entirety of the runes, perhaps, from the very top of the amphitheater. But fighters were never allowed to leave the battlefield, unless it was to return to the dungeon. In the absence of an aerial view, all he could do was to try and compile the disjointed pieces of the puzzle in his mind. By now, Sunny had fought in most of the killing boxes in the arena, except for a few. After defeating another group of warmongers and being thrown back into the cage, he spent the entire night trying to remember each of the stages he had shed blood on and the pattern of the grooves on their floor. It was like assembling a complicated puzzle, only instead of the actual pieces, all he had were fragmented memories of them. Luckily, his memory had always been good. In fact, after becoming an awakened and having the opportunity to interact with a lot of different people, many of whom were very smart and educated, Sunny realized that his ability to instantly memorize things were somewhat unnatural even among them. Before, he had just assumed that everyone could do the same. Still, he had to have paid attention to a thing in order to remember it, which was not the case with all of the grooves, only those that had happened to appear in his way. Plus, he was also having trouble determining how the irregularly shaped killing boxes were situated in relation to each other, since that wasn't something he had thought about before. The task of creating a perfect three-dimensional replica of the entire arena in his mind was not an easy one. Over the next few days, he was somewhat distracted while fighting the nightmare creatures in the Red Colosseum. Confounded by the fact that their enemies were growing stronger and stronger as all the weaker slaves were being slowly slaughtered, his performance suffered. And that meant more injuries, more pain, and more torment. Sometimes, he felt utterly beaten, broken, and hopeless. Sunny was familiar with suffering and hardship, and had experienced a fair share of horrific anguish in his life. But the trial of the Red Colosseum had turned out to be a hell so dire that even he was having difficulty enduring its burden. It was simply too cruel, too odious, too vile. And that harrowing torture was not going to end until he gave up. But he didn't. The strange task of peering into the secrets of the demon of desire kept him going, no matter how wounded his body and how broken his spirit became. It was almost like an obsession. Sunny continued to fight and kill and suffer, and study the ancient stones. His mental condition deteriorated so much that even Elyas, who was going through his own terrible ordeal, noticed that something was very wrong with his taciturn demonic partner. The young man tried to encourage the shadow creature as well as he could, but what could he say to soothe the soul-crushing despair of their situation? They were enslaved, locked in cages, and forced to fight for their lives against a swarm of deadly monsters, only to be thrown back behind the iron bars, fed the raw flesh of the abominations they had just killed, and go through the whole nightmare again the next day, with no hope of ever escaping except for through death, through being killed and eaten by the other prisoners of the Red Colosseum. Even their captors seemed to be trapped by the Colosseum, chained in the same vicious cycle, and doomed to eventually share the same fate as their slaves. Inside this ancient theater, only bloodshed and madness reigned. And yet, all of it was not for nothing. Eventually, After Sonny had lost count of the days they had spent in the Colosseum, he finally managed to create a complete image of it in his head. With it came the understanding of the shapes of the giant runes that were cut in the blood-soaked stone. And with that understanding came the ability to peer into their purpose. After learning the shape and position of the runes, Sonny found himself able to peer beneath the surface of the stone and see their function. The ability had always been within him, hiding in the depths of his changed eyes. He just had not known where and how to look, like he had not been aware of his ability to see the soul cores of creatures before clashing with Mordred within the Soul Sea. Armed with the new knowledge, Sonny was able to perceive vast rivers of soul essence flowing beneath the arena and through its walls, following intricate paths carved for it by the immense runes. In the end, that was what sorcery was. The ability to guide and shape hidden energies, most often that of souls, to express one's will upon the world. The enchantments were simply expressions of the enchanter's will, and the runes were the building blocks with which the enchanter manipulated the movement of energy to achieve their goal. But where was all this soul energy coming from? At first, Sonny assumed that the Red Colosseum was similar to the Crimson Labyrinth and fed on the souls of creatures slain within it. Slaves slaughtering each other in the arena must have been empowering the sorcery, enslaving them by the very act of slaughter. But after observing the flow of soul essence through the ancient structure for a while, he realized that his initial theory was wrong. Instead of the fighters, it was the crowd of spectators that fueled the enchantments. It was their jubilation, their elation, their sincere excitement that were the source of all the power flowing through the ancient theater. Of course, why would the demon of desire base her sorcery on death? Her domain was built upon dreams, emotions, and passion. It was only after the followers of War God had usurped the Colosseum that the subject of all this passion became battle, bloodshed, and murder. The current state of the arena was not how it had been supposed to be. It was stolen, perverted, and made into something utterly different, corrupted. More than a month had already passed after Sonny entered the second nightmare. The dungeon was growing less and less crowded. Most of the prisoners long killed on the bloody stones of the arena, the end of the hateful trials, whatever it was supposed to be, was approaching. Now, he knew the basic principle of how the enchantments keeping him tied to the Red Colosseum functioned. So the question was, how was he supposed to use that knowledge to escape? Sonny had no clue how to create, decipher, or manipulate runic magic. His inherent ability to see the weave and inner structure of magical items, the one he had received after consuming the drop of ichor that fell from Weaver's eye, also gifted him with an innate understanding of the essence of spellweave. While studying the memories created by spell, Sonny was not able to fully understand the intricate purpose of the vast patterns of ethereal strings. But he at least could intuitively feel a hint of it. He had no such advantage when it came to other forms of sorcery. So, despite the fact that he had managed to perceive the enchantments encompassing the Red Colosseum, it was not like he could simply change them, or create new ones to counteract the old. He could study the runes, of course, but with no teacher and only his wit and intelligence to help him draw the correct conclusions from observing various enchantments. It would take hundreds of years to gain enough insight to learn how to create any meaningful runic sorcery of his own. Sonny, however, wasn't discouraged. Yes, he would not be able to create runic sorcery anytime soon, but destroying things was always much easier than making them. Locked inside the narrow cage, surrounded by the smell of nightmare creatures and filth, Sonny stared into the darkness and thought, destroy the enchantments of the Red Colosseum. In theory, it was simple to achieve. He just had to break enough runes to disrupt the paths they created for the soul energy. The problem with that, however, was that the runes Hope had used were giant and carved into nearly unbreakable stone. Sonny doubted that he would be able to do enough damage to the arena to cause its sorcery to fail. Causing a smaller and temporary disruption, however, was not entirely impossible. He felt that he would be able to achieve that much at least. Perhaps enough to free himself of the binding enchantment for a second or few. Would several seconds of freedom be enough to escape this cursed place? It was going to have to be. As he waited in the darkness, A seed of a desperate plan started forming in his mind. At some point, Sunny straightened and sat cross-legged at the center of the cage, causing it to sway lightly. Raising one of his 4 monstrous hands, he stared at it for a while, and then commanded shadow essence to stream forward, concentrating at the tips of his fingers. Even since he had consumed Weaver's alabaster phalanx and acquired bone weave, the tactile sense of his fingers went through a strange metamorphosis. It was now much more nuanced, vibrant, and keen. Even though his hands were currently bestial and covered by thick calluses, this sensitivity remained. As shadow essence concentrated in the tips of his fingers, he felt a strange, ghostly tingling sensation. It was so real as to almost appear physical. Tentatively raising another hand, Sunny hesitated for a few moments, then pinched the air near one of his tingling fingers and tried to pull essence outward. To his surprise, it worked. In his mind's eye, a strand of darkness suddenly extended into the air, summoned by his hand. It didn't look like one of the radiant strings he was used to seeing inside memories, and neither did it look like the flowing liquid that essence was usually depicted as. Instead, the strand of shadow essence looked like a tenebrous fog, similar to the gray wisps that rose from Saint's armor when one of the shadows wrapped itself around her. It was insubstantial, ephemeral, and elusive, not at all like the sharp and beautiful strings that Spellweave was created of. Sunny frowned slightly and pulled the fog with one hand while trying to get a hold of it with the other, wishing to draw it taut and thus more concentrated. However, this small movement instantly caused the strand to break, dissipate, and disappear, blown away by a gust of wind. Sunny muttered, "This is going to take some time." Grim Sunny continued to draw on his shadow essence and try to form it into a thin and durable string, emptying a small portion of his reserves with each failure. By the time morning came, he had not made any progress at all, and only managed to waste most of his essence in futile attempts. Fighting after wasting so much power was going to cost him a lot. Soon, the ascended jailer appeared from the darkness, chains rattling on his belt. Sunny glanced at the giant in a tattered red robe, and then closed his eyes for a moment. Sunny muttered, "Doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. I'll be dead either way, but now at least there's a chance." He fought in the arena, killed the nightmare creatures, retrieved the soul shard to empower Elyas, and then barely survived in the battle against the awakened warriors on the final stage. At night, he continued to experiment with shadow essence, trying to shape the elusive fog into something resembling an ethereal, resilient string. When his essence ran dry, he slept for a few minutes, and then woke up with a startle to start all over again. When the morning came, he fought. When the murdering was over and done with, hidden in the darkness, he tried to weave strings out of the effervescent fog. The idea itself seemed ridiculous, mad, and impossible. How could something so intangible become something strong, durable, and distinct? He sundered flesh and had his flesh sundered, then struggled to create something out of nothing, day after day, night after day. Time lost any meaning. Sunny had already been struggling to hold on, but now, drained by the lack of sleep, the constant pressure of trying to shape essence into a magical string, and the need to fight in the arena with his reserves half empty because of it, he was slowly sliding into the dark and bottomless abyss. And yet, he persisted in his obsession, teaching his fingers to feel the smallest fluctuations of the fog to guide and shape it, trying one approach after another, endlessly, without resting or giving up. And by the time his second month in the Red Colosseum was coming to the end, and most of the cages in the lightless dungeon hung empty, Sunny suddenly straightened, staring at his cut, trembling hands. Between them, a single ethereal string hovered, black as night, thinner than a hair, and as sharp as a diamond blade. A low growl escaped from his mouth. Sunny breathed, "It's done. I've done it." Sunny remained motionless for a while, then shifted slightly, causing the chain of his cage to rattle. Attracted by the sound, Elyas woke up from his restless sleep and stared into the darkness, a tired expression on his young face.
"Oh demons, what happened?"
In the next moment, he heard the sound of a heavy body slamming against the iron bars and then another crash. His partner's cage swung widely, and at the highest point of its swing, a long arm suddenly shot from between the bars, claws scraping against metal as Sunny took hold of the youth's own gibbet. Elyas flinched. Elyas stammered, "Wah, what are you doing?" Sunny growled, trying to express his intention as best as he could. The young awakened didn't know how to read the runic language he knew how to write, so this was the only way of communication between them. Luckily, an honest effort to answer truthfully was enough for the flaw. It didn't punish Sunny for not being able to deliver the truth as long as he really tried to. Their cages hung diagonally, connected by his hand. Sunny groaned, straining his muscles to pull them even closer together. Then, staring at the young man's pale face, Sunny took hold of the bars with two more hands and stretched the fourth one to grab the awakened by the throat. Elyas' eyes widened slightly, but he didn't even try to struggle. The youth simply looked at him, no fear written on his gaunt and emaciated but still childishly soft face. Instead, there was only confusion and trust. Sunny sighed. Sunny thought, what a fool. If I wanted to, I could have snapped his neck right here and now. Of course, he had no such intentions. Instead, Sunny brought the youth closer and stared intently at the steel collar wrapped around his neck, studying it. He couldn't really see his own, so this was the next best thing. Elyas remained motionless for a while, then said,
"I don't know what you are trying to do, demon, but you better stop it before the priest comes to check on the noise."
Sunny scowled, then let go, causing their cages to swing away from each other. Elyas was right, there were mere seconds left before the Ascended showed up, judging by how long it had taken the solemn giant to appear before. He was always somewhere near, ready to intervene in case the slaves misbehaved. Sunny had timed their jailer's reaction time many, so he knew that much. It didn't matter anyway. He had already seen all that he needed to see. The pattern of runes carved inside the collar, and the stream of soul essence running through it. This was what he needed to disrupt. Sunny was going to have to work fast. Several days later, looking more like a corpse than a living being, he was laying at the bottom of the cage looking at his hands. Between them, a complicated cradle of black strings was weaved together, forming a strange and hypnotic pattern. Sunny had advanced a lot in his ability to thread shadow strings and loop them between his fingers. Sadly, it was not without cost. The strings were ephemeral and unseen to anyone except him, which also meant that they could not interact with the material world. However, they could interact with his flesh, which was why two of his fingers were missing, each sliced away so cleanly that it seemed as though they had never existed. Even his phalanxes, reinforced by the evolved bone weave, had not offered the essence strings any resistance. All that remained were two bloody stumps. The rest of his fingers were cut and mangled, but still in place, considering that there were 18 of them left. He still had more than a human would. Not that it diminished the pain he was constantly experiencing. It would have certainly been helpful to have a tool to work the black strings instead of doing it with his bare hands, something like a needle perhaps. Coincidentally, he had one of those in his possession, a needle used by Weaver themselves, no less. But it was locked away in his soul sea, safely kept and utterly inaccessible inside the covetous coffer. So, he just had to endure and be very, very careful, lest the number of his fingers diminished even further. There was another problem, though. Sunny had inherited an intuitive understanding of the guiding principles of spellweave, but it was not like he really knew what to do. All he had was his memory of the spellweave patterns he had seen before, and a vague feeling of the purpose behind them. This was not enough to master sorcery, but it was at least a start. Each memory he had studied before had unique enchantments, so he couldn't draw parallels between them and extrapolate how their weaves produced the desired effects. There were magical qualities that all memories shared, however. The ability to be summoned and dismissed, the ability to repair themselves unless completely destroyed, and the connection to the owner's soul. Knowing these three ubiquitous traits, Sunny could, in theory, determine which parts of the weaves were the exact same across all memories, and thus were responsible for these effects. Then, he could try to recreate them. Each spellweave was incredibly complex, so recalling even a single pattern perfectly was a challenge, despite him having a very good memory. Sunny, however, had to recall not only many, but but also do so with a sufficient degree of precision to be able to compare and find similarities between them. And then, he had to somehow rebuild the repeating parts of those weaves with nothing but his bare hands and shallow reserves of shadow essence. The task seemed nearly impossible. But fueled by obsession, resolve, and desperation, he had succeeded, and also failed. After thousands of attempts, Sunny was finally able to perfectly recreate one of the 3 patterns he had managed to isolate. But as soon as the pattern was complete, it instantly fell apart. No matter how many times he repeated the process, the result was the same. For some reason, the weave didn't hold. It wasn't able to sustain itself. Something was missing. Today, Sunny was going to perform another experiment, perhaps the last one. He was tired, drained, and terribly hurt. Whatever hope he had managed to find before in this blood-soaked hell was on the verge of running out. He was almost ready to give up. But not just yet. There was one other thing that all memories contained. Not a part of the pattern of ethereal strings, but something different. A bright ember that served as the anchor and nexus for the strings. A point around which the whole pattern was structured. Memories of the first tier had one, and those of the higher tiers had several. After considering that fact, Sunny had brought something back from the arena today. A single soul shard that he had not given to Elyas, instead keeping it for himself. The shard had belonged to a fearsome, awakened demon he killed earlier today in one of the killing boxes of the Red Colosseum. Now, looking at the cat's cradle of ethereal black strings drawn between his fingers, he hesitated for a long time, and then carefully placed the gleaming crystal in its center. Then, holding his breath, Sunny slowly started connecting each of the strings to the shard, moving his fingers with extreme speed and nimbleness. Slowly, a black pattern started shaping around the bright ember, strangely not permeating a different object, but instead looping back on itself. And after something that felt like an eternity, with drops of blood rolling down his hands, Sunny finally let go of the strings and stared at the soul shard laying on his palm. A beautiful pattern of tenebrous strings hovered in the air around it, stable, without a single flaw or weakness to cause it to fall apart. He sighed, and then weaved the last string into the pattern, connecting its other end to the shadow core in his chest. Finally, Sunny closed his eyes and gave the mental command. In front of him, the soul shard disintegrated into a rain of white sparks, and then appeared once again, creating itself out of nothingness. Sunny let out a long, heavy breath. This was the first sorcery he had woven. Sunny breathed in, then breathed out, calming down his widely beating heart. His hands were trembling so hard that the softly gleaming soul shard almost fell out of his grip. Sunny called out, hey, Elyas, look, it's finished." He tiredly turned his head and let out a low growl, trying to attract the young man's attention. But his partner did not even move, laying at the bottom of his cage and staring into the darkness with bleak, hollow eyes. The last few days, the youth's condition wasn't too good. He even stopped having his one-sided conversations with Sunny and just sat quietly in the darkness, not moving, until the next morning came and it was time to fight again. Sunny lingered for a few moments, then turned away. Sunny murmured, "It's all right, rest, I'll get us out of here soon. We will be free, Elyas, just hold on a little longer." There wasn't much time left. In all of the vile dungeon, barely 4 dozen nightmare creatures were left alive. Their grotesque forms towered in the darkness, locked inside enchanted cages, the long stretches of empty space between hinting that the trials of the Red Colosseum were going to come to an end soon. And then, Solvin and her followers would spend another decade hunting down a new hecatomb of monsters to sacrifice to their bloodthirsty god. Sunny's mouth twitched. Sunny muttered dismissively, "Who cares? They are all just illusions anyway. The real Solvin is long dead. The real Elyas is dead too. Who cares what happens to them?" He stole a glance at the crestfallen youth and then looked away. But were they really? Forcing his trembling hands to grow steady, Sunny hesitated, then studied the soul shard he had just enchanted. He didn't know what the spell used to create the embers serving as anchors for its weaves. Whatever it was, there certainly was a connection to soul cores, after all the tier, and subsequently, the number of nexuses a memory's spellweave possessed. was directly tied to the number of soul cores that the source of the memory had. However, those embers weren't actual soul shards. Most likely, since shards were harvested from the carcasses of nightmare creatures even if the kill had produced a memory. Sonny didn't care, though. Without a better alternative, all he could do was use one in place of the other. He steadied himself, looked upon his demonic figure through the eyes of the shadow, and then dismissed the soul shard once again. This time, however, Sonny did something strange. He willed the enchanted crystal to remain in an ambivalent state, not quite gone, also not quite tangible. Then he reached into the weave of the black strings and slowly untangled it, breaking the loops and allowing the ends of the tenebrous threads to float free. And finally, after that was done, he started to weave the whole pattern, including the ethereal soul shard, into the cold steel of his collar. Slowly but surely, he integrated the spellweave into the band wrapped around his neck, submerging it into the flowing stream of soul essence. The task was tenuous, perplexing, and intricate, but it wasn't too complicated. The pattern was already made, and all he had to do was to connect it to a new vessel. After a while, he was finished. The soul shard disappeared from his hands and from the material world entirely. Instead, it was now burning beneath the surface of the collar, the black strings extending from it and spreading through the steel. Now, the collar looked almost like a memory, and even its nexus was almost undistinguishable from the embers Sonny had seen before. Of course, there was a second enchantment inside of it, this one much more complex and elaborate, crafted from ethereal runes. It was all a proper mess, just like he wanted it to be. Sonny held his breath, and then tried to dismiss the collar. The band of metal around his neck shimmered and suddenly turned extremely cold. Inside it, two energies clashed with each other, both enchantments momentarily failing. He felt a sudden shift, a sudden change in the air, and inside of him, as though a long-forgotten part of his being had awakened from a long slumber. Full of fear and excitement, Sonny did something that he had done countless times before but never knew to value. Sonny whispered, "One." He summoned the runes. Familiar symbols appeared in the air in front of him, their sight as sweet as honey. Name sunless, true name lost from light, rank awakened. Sonny whispered, "Two." Sonny turned away from the runes and peered into the collar, observing the battle of the two enchantments within. Simultaneously, he grabbed the steel with two of his hands and threw all his monstrous strength into trying to pull it apart. But the collar held firm, as though utterly indestructible. Sonny whispered, "Three." On the count of 7, the soul shard he had placed within the band of steel suddenly burst into a myriad of sparks, and the weave of black strings he had so arduously threaded fell apart, turning into the gray fog and disappearing. The original flow of soul essence was unobstructed once again, and the runic enchantment resumed its function. Sonny was not disappointed. For now, all he wanted was to learn how long his sabotage was going to last. Sonny muttered, 7 seconds. A dark grin appeared on his face. Sonny murmured, 7 seconds will be more than enough. The next day, hurting and barely alive, he brought another soul shard back with him from the arena. Tonight was going to be the night of their escape. Sonny wasn't sure that he would be able to endure any longer. If he had any chance to break free, he had to take it now. The plan was long finalized in his mind, and even though he was frightened to put it in motion, there was no other way. As Elyas fell on the bottom of his cage and closed his eyes, too tired to eat the disgusting raw meat thrown to them by the ascended warrior, Sonny concentrated on weaving a new enchantment. He was now proficient enough to create black strings rather swiftly, even though hurrying threatened to cost him another finger or two. Still, in a few hours, he had threaded enough to repeat the simple weave of a summoning enchantment. Following the same steps that he had taken yesterday, Sonny created the pattern around the soul shard and then integrated it into the collar. The two enchantments clashed again, gifting him several short moments of freedom. This time, Sonny did not waste any of them. As soon as the enchantment of the collar was disrupted, breaking his connection to the red Colosseum, he took a deep breath and fell through the shadows. A moment later, Sonny found himself standing on the cold stone floor a couple of steps away from a swaying, empty cage. He was free. For 6 more seconds at least. 7. Sunny stepped through the shadows and appeared outside of the cage, his towering figure finally free and unconstrained by the suffocating iron bars. He staggered as excruciating pain spread through his mutilated flesh, a myriad of badly healed wounds reminding him of their festering existence, and hissed. Elyas suddenly moved, confused by the direction from which the familiar hiss came. Then he grabbed the bars and stared at Sunny with wide eyes. 7. Sunny stepped through the shadows and appeared outside of the cage, his towering figure finally free and unconstrained by the suffocating iron bars. He staggered as excruciating pain spread through his mutilated flesh, a myriad of badly healed wounds reminding him of their festering existence, and hissed. Elyas suddenly moved, confused by the direction from which the familiar hiss came. Then he grabbed the bars and stared at Sunny with wide eyes. Elyas stammered, struggling to find words. All of a sudden, he could see his partner clearly in the darkness, because the obsidian body of the shadow creature had become enveloped by a storm of swirling sparks of light. Sunny had begun to summon his memories. The undying chain, the cruel sight, the midnight shard, the prowling thorn. 6. The Stygian serpent drawn on his skin suddenly moved, slithering forth to turn into a fearsome black Odachi. Its sharp tip appeared in the air above one of Sunny's hands and grew, swiftly forming into the length of the great blade. At the same time, two ruby eyes ignited in the depths of his shadow with a furious light. Elyas flinched, staring at the gaunt demon in front of him in stunned awe. 5. Saint stepped out of the darkness, her graceful figure as black as the onyx, her posture straight and indomitable. Her hands were empty, devoid for now of any weapon. Sunny stared at his shadow with grim joy and then bared his fangs, greeting her. He wasn't sure, but he thought that he noticed a slight change to the set of the taciturn knight's shoulders. Had she missed him too? 4. The hilt of the soul serpent fell into his hand. The length of the Odachi considerably increased to account for his towering height. Sunny didn't hesitate and threw the great blade to Saint, who caught it calmly and weighed the weapon in her hand, the hue of her ruby eyes suddenly growing a little brighter. It almost seemed like the shadow was excited. Sunny glanced into the depths of the dungeon, where dozens of mighty nightmare creatures still remained locked in cages, waiting for their turn to be slaughtered in the arena. Then he turned to Saint, 3, and said,
Kill them all.
She tilted her head, sparing him a short look, and then wordlessly disappeared into the darkness, the black blade of the soul serpent raised to deliver the first killing blow. 2. A moment later, something whistled through the air, and a bestial scream thundered in the silence of the nightmarish dungeon. Sunny wasn't paying attention, though. The plan was already in motion, and his efforts were required somewhere else. The familiar voice whispered into his ear, making him shiver.
You have slain. Oh, how he longed to hear it once more. Your shadow grows stronger.
In one of Sunny's hands, a somber shortsword appeared, weaved out of tenebrous fog. In another, a stalwart Takai manifested itself. Sunny gripped the hilt of the midnight shard with both of his upper hands, leaving the cruel sight in one of the lower ones. The undying chain finally finished appearing from a whirlwind of white sparks, covering his body with a caparase of bleak steel. Its shape changed to accommodate Sunny's monstrous body. New plates of perfectly fitted armor encompassing his digitigrade legs, his 4 arms, and even his long tail, a sharp metal spike protruding from the tip of it. His gauntlets ended in vicious steel claws, and his helmet had 2 holes at the top for his curved horns to fit through. Instead of a gaunt creature with a terribly mangled body, a fearsome steel Goliath now stood amid the empty cages, jagged horns crowning the featureless steel plane of his face. 1. Sunny dismissed his helmet and felt the collar snap back into function. Immediately, he sensed that his ability to shadow step was restrained again, and his connection to the spell was cut. The sparks that had almost coalesced into the prowling Thord disappeared, and the unfinished form of the heavy kunai with them. It didn't matter. He had already achieved everything he needed to achieve in these 7 seconds. Sonny could have used that time to shadow step as far as he could, escaping the premises of the Red Colosseum. However, that would have left him with no essence in the middle of Solving's territory, with the accursed collar still wrapped around his neck. It was easy to leave the Red Colosseum, but it was much harder to escape it. As long as Sonny was collared, he was going to remain tied to the enchantments of the ancient theater. He was still going to be a slave. Plus, there was a thing he wasn't willing to leave behind. Sonny heard Saint slaughtering the second nightmare creature and turned to Elyas, who was staring at him with wide eyes. The youth was still trapped in the cage. Of course, Sonny could have left him to die. In fact, doing so was probably an obvious decision. The young awakened wasn't real after all. Only maybe he was. Sonny had no idea whether these people were illusions or not. That was what the government and the common knowledge had told him. But was that knowledge the truth? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the shadows of the Mountain King and the old slaver he had killed in the first nightmare were still in his soul sea, undistinguishable from all the rest of the creatures he had slain in the real world and the dream realm. An illusion created by the spell, if that was what they were, might as well have possessed a soul. And a shadow, if so, were they so different from real people? In any case, it didn't really matter. In the reality of the nightmare, Elyas was a living being. His partner, Sonny, was determined to save him as well. The two of them were fated to die in the arena. Well, fate could go screw itself. They had kept each other alive in the Red Colosseum, and now both of them were going to escape it. Together, that was his furious, adamant resolution. Plus, Sonny really needed Elyas for his plan of escape to work. The problem, however, was the cage. It was forged out of the same indestructible alloy as their collars, so getting the youth out of it was not going to be easy. With a low growl, Sonny jumped onto the hanging cage, grabbing the bars with the curved talons on his feet, and swung the midnight shard. He wasn't aiming at the cage itself. Instead, he was aiming at the chain attaching it to the ceiling. Reinforced by the shadows, the austere tack cut through the rusty chain, easily breaking it apart. The cage fell to the floor, sending a loud rumble rolling through the dark dungeon, and then toppled to the side. Locked inside, Elyas was thrown down. Almost immediately, though, the youth regained his balance and crouched, staring at Sonny with wild eyes.
Hurry, whatever you're planning, demon, hurry. The priest is going to be here soon.
Sonny shivered, remembering the aura of savage, crushing strength radiating from their ascended jailer, and the cold glint of his terrifying blade. Elyas didn't need to remind him. Sonny was painfully aware of how little time he had left. Metal of the collars and the cages could not be broken, but it didn't mean that it couldn't be bent. Twisting a band of steel wrapped tightly around your neck would not have been a great idea. However, the iron bars trapping Elyas were another matter entirely. Sonny just needed good leverage, and that was why he had cut the cage down. Throwing a nervous look back in the direction from which the red priest usually appeared, he gritted his teeth and thrust one hand through the bars, pushing Elyas back. He needed to soften the metal first, and that was going to be a dire process. The blade of the cruel sight suddenly shone with radiant white light, spreading an almost palpable heat into the cold air of the ghastly dungeon. Sonny didn't linger and pressed the somber sword against the steel bars, letting the divine flame contained within share its immolating incandescence with the enchanted cage. There were two possible results for his actions. One was that he would be able to soften the metal and bend it. The other was that he was going to cook Elyas alive inside the gibbet. There was also the chance that their ascended jailer would arrive quicker than usual, which would be really bad. Sonny counted the seconds and stared at the iron bars, willing them to heat up swifter. Slowly, the cold metal turned slightly red, then bright orange. Finally, at the point where the incandescent blade of the cruel sight touched them, a hint of pure white appeared. Sonny would have preferred to wait longer, but there was no more time. Dropping the short sword to the ground and biting down on the midnight shard with his fangs, he grabbed the scorching metal with all four of his hands and endured the pain of the furious heat slowly spreading through the gauntlets to his bare skin. Then, Sonny set his foot on another bar, commanded all three shadows to wrap themselves around his body, and pulled. Now that the cage was on the ground and stable, he could use all the muscles in his demonic body to put pressure on it, not just those in his arms. His core, his shoulders, his back, his powerful thighs and calf muscles. The entirety of his body worked in unison in order to bend the steel bars. A stifled roar escaped from his mouth, washing over the blade of the austere tack and echoing in the cold darkness. Sonny pulled and pushed in opposite directions with all his monstrous strength. Already a demon and augmented by the three shadows, he was terrifyingly powerful. And yet, the incandescent bars refused to budge, for a few seconds at least. Then, when his muscles seemed to be on the verge of exploding from the inhuman strain, the metal finally gave in. With a metallic groan, one of the bars started to bend slightly at first, and then more and more. Sonny hissed under his breath, urging the metal to give way, muttering for it to come on, come on. Elyas, however, did not seem to share Sonny's jubilation. Instead, he paled, a frightened expression appearing on his face. Without saying a word, the youth raised one hand, pointing to somewhere behind his partner's back. Sonny let out a fierce, triumphant exclamation.
"Th the priest."
And just then, Sonny felt a mighty shadow flying toward him from the edges of his shadow sense, growing closer and closer with harrowing speed. Sonny breathed a bitter curse. The Ascended arrived a few seconds earlier than he should have. Without turning around, Sonny pulled on the incandescent bar one last time, creating enough distance between it and the next one for the youth to squeeze through. Then, he reached inside the cage, grabbed the young awakened, and roughly pulled him through the narrow breach. He already could hear the heavy steps behind him. Sonny muttered a frantic string of curses under his breath. Elyas stared into the darkness with eyes full of fear. He started to shout a warning about the demon behind them. But the words died in his throat. Without letting him finish, Sonny forcefully pushed the youth away, then swiftly turned around, grabbing the cruel sight from the ground and catching the hilt of the midnight shard. The warrior in a tattered red robe and worn leather armor was already upon him, the terrifying heavy blade cutting through the air with unthinkable speed. Sonny moved his weapons forward, trying to block the obliterating blow. But his exhausted, wounded body seemed to have finally betrayed him. He swayed, missing the timing by a split second. It looked like the tiniest of mistakes. But one mistake was all it took. His luck had run out. The great blade of the mighty Ascended slid past Sonny's defenses and hit him right in the neck. The sharp metal sliced through his tough skin, his muscles, and his spine, emerging in a fountain of blood from the other side. Sonny felt terrifying pain spread through his whole being, and then the world suddenly spun. The head of the shadow demon flew high into the air, disbelief still frozen in his lightless eyes. It was as though it was screaming. As though it was trying to say something, to share a fatal revelation that had come a few moments too late, that there was no escape except through death. Elyas staggered, a stunned expression contorting his soft, youthful face.
Demons you."
In front of him, the legs of the decapitated demon buckled, and his towering body, still clad in bleak steel, fell heavily to its knees. Just like that, his partner was gone. His partner's nightmare was over. The young man froze for a moment, then turned to the indifferent murderer, sorrow and wrath mixing in his hollow, tired, light blue eyes.
"You I'll kill."
The priest of war remained silent, disinterested in the rambling of the young slave. He turned to Elyas and made a step forward, raising the monstrous blade once again. It was all over, or perhaps not, because at that moment, the decapitated body suddenly stirred and attacked the indifferent slaughterer, the radiant blade of the cruel sight entering the man's abdomen while the tip of the midnight shard pierced his chest. At the same time, the tail of the dead demon shot over his shoulder, penetrating one of the red priest's eyes with the long steel spike. Laying on the filthy stones a few meters away, Sonny's head observed it all with a terribly pained expression.
Hurts, crap, dying really hurts.
Yes, having your head separated from your body was not the most pleasant of experiences. In fact, it was probably one of the worst. However, Sonny really needed that to have happened. This was the only method to get rid of the unbreakable slave collar he had managed to come up with. He had even considered chopping his head off himself, but came to the conclusion that his own strength was not going to be enough to overcome the durability of bone weave. So, he had decided to try and use the might of an ascended apostle of war instead. Death, indeed, was the only escape. In front of him, a river of blood flowed from the body of the taciturn master. The Red Priest had lowered his guard, thinking that the shadow demon was dead, and received not one but 3 whole fatal wounds as the result. Honestly, he should have been more careful. The dead were often the most troublesome of enemies, after all. As the body in the tattered red robe slowly toppled and fell to the ground, the headless body of the demon raised one hand, hooked a claw beneath the slave collar, and tore it off its severed neck. The band of metal rang as it hit the floor. Sonny was not dead, of course, thanks to the undying enchantment of his transcendent armor. For as long as it was active, he would remain alive and even in control of his body. This was the good part. The bad part was that the enchantment was devouring his essence with an inconceivable speed, and in the next few seconds, when his reserves ran completely dry, Sonny was really going to die. Before that happened, the headless demon took a few unsteady steps forward, nonchalantly picked up its head, and awkwardly placed it on his neck. Then he approached Elyas and fell to his knees in front of the petrified youth. Sonny urged him urgently, his voice strained, telling the fool to come on, that he didn't have much time. Due to the fact that his mouth wasn't currently connected to his lungs, Sonny couldn't even growl to pull the young awakened out of his stupor. Luckily, Elyas shook it off himself, flinching and throwing his hands into the air to place them on both sides of Sonny's mutilated neck.
So Lord, O gods, O Lord, hold on, demon.
He activated his healing ability, trying to make the cleanly severed head of the shadow creature attach itself back to the flat stump of his neck. Sonny shuddered, overwhelmed by terrifying pain.
How does it even make sense? Why am I in so much pain? My brain isn't even connected to those nerves. Curses, damnation.
For almost anyone else, recovering from having their head cut off would have been nearly impossible. However, Sonny was a bit special, because avoiding death was one of his specialties. There were several factors that played to his advantage. Firstly, the Midnight Shard had judged his current state dire enough to unlock the hidden well of power that its unbroken enchantment granted him. Secondly, his bones and his blood were transformed by Weaver's lineage, gifting him with inhuman tenacity. That was the reason why he had not bled out already, and why his body was capable of rapid healing. All those qualities were enhanced by the drop of Shadow God's ichor that Blood Weave had unceremoniously devoured, and then augmented ever further by the Midnight Shard. And lastly, while Undying was rapidly consuming his reserves of shadow essence, Saint was out there in the darkness, slaying one powerful nightmare creature after another. She was wielding the Black Odachi, whose Soul Reaver ability transferred a portion of essence of all creatures slain by the serpent in either its soul weapon or soul beast form. So, with each mighty abomination Saint killed, Sonny received a considerable amount of essence, thus allowing him to keep the undying enchantment active longer. Was it going to be long enough for him to survive, though? That was what he was going to find out. Torturous seconds passed, with Elyas desperately trying to heal the harrowing wound, and Sonny desperately observing his reserves of shadow essence plummeting further and further. The rate with which the undying chain was eating through his essence was much faster than the rate with which Saint and Serpent replenished it. He was only able to slow down the inevitable, not stop it. His whole being was overwhelmed with agony and pain. But what else was new? Even though Sonny had never had his head chopped off before, he experienced similar tortures, if not worse. There was almost no shadow essence left in his cores. And then there was none. The undying enchantment deactivated, but Sonny was still alive. He moved his lips and tentatively touched his neck, which had a ghastly scar running all around it now. Then he bent over and spat out a torrent of blood. Sonny felt terrible. He felt like a zombie. But he was not dead. More than that, he was now truly, really free. Sonny remained motionless for a few moments. then hissed quietly, which made it feel as though his throat was being sawed open by tens of dull, rusty knives. His head was once again attached to his neck. However, that didn't mean that he felt fine. In fact, although he had avoided becoming a corpse, he still felt like one.
Your shadow grows stronger.
The dark dungeon suddenly grew silent. Saint must have finished off the last of the caged nightmare creatures, turning him and Elyas into the last surviving captives of the Red Colosseum. No matter what happened from now on, the ghastly trials were over, finished before time by her hand. Sunny sensed a bit of shadow essence pour into his cores, replenishing the empty reserves a little, and scowled. That wasn't much. The young awakened had wasted all of his essence while healing Sunny as well. The two of them were not going to survive if they had to fight a prolonged battle, so they needed to flee the Colosseum swiftly and before the rest of the Warmongers noticed their escape. Gritting his teeth, Sunny staggered and rose to his feet, then threw a somber glance at Elyas, who was staring at him with wide eyes. The youth still had a collar wrapped around his neck. However, there was not much Sunny could do about that right now. It was not like he could behead the young awakened, too. Hopefully. His strength alone was going to be enough to deliver them both away from this cursed place. Now that he was connected to the spell and had access to all of his power, there were a lot of things that could be done. The damned zealots were going to regret ever capturing him. Elyas opened his mouth, then asked in a shaking voice,
Demon, how are you still alive?
Sunny tilted his head, grimaced, and decided to not move his neck too much in the future. Then he gestured at the breastplate of the undying chain. The young awakened frowned.
Your armor, it's a relic. Wait, where did you even get this fearsome armor and all these magical weapons?
Sunny sighed, then nodded and pointed at his chest again. Elyas blinked a couple of times.
What do you mean they were inside of you all along? Why have you not used them in the arena then?
One of the demon's hands rose and pointed at the collar that now lay harmlessly on the filthy stones. The youth frowned.
Oh, I see. The war god's binding must have hidden you from the sight of the Lord of Shadows and robbed you of his blessings. But then...
Sunny sighed and pressed a finger against his lips, commanding Elyas to be quiet. At the same time, Saint appeared from the darkness, drops of fetid black blood still dripping from the blade of the great Odachi. Her gaze was calm and indifferent as always. The youth stared at the taciturn demon for a few moments, then bowed respectfully.
You have my gratitude for coming to our aid, venerable Lady Shade.
Saint looked at the young man, without showing any sign of having an opinion on being addressed in such a peculiar manner.
Poor fool must be thinking that she is another shadow creature that came to rescue her kin. Me, that is, and judging by this reaction, he also seems to be convinced that she is my senior in the hierarchy of shadows. What the hell, why are teenagers always convinced that Saint is cooler than me?
He was in no mood to disabuse the youth of this misconception, though. Plus, there was no time. A scorched kite shield manifested itself from sparks of light in Saint's hand, and at the same time, the soul serpent turned into a stream of flowing darkness and reformed itself into a straight double-edged sword, this one akin to the weapon the graceful knight had wielded in the past. Sunny hesitated for a moment, then pushed the hilt of the midnight shard into Elyas' hands, holding the cruel sight in one of his own. He bent down and picked up the terrifying heavy blade of the Red Priest with the upper pair. Sunny didn't know what enchantments exactly the two-handed cleaver possessed, but since it had managed to slice through his adamantine spine without too much trouble, they had to be exceptionally powerful. Then he took a deep breath and sent his shadows forth, along the familiar corridors of the underground part of the Colosseum and beyond them, to find a way to freedom. Sunny was good enough in a fight to survive in the arena, and even earn the love and admiration of the damned lunatics who spectated the slaughter and worshipped it. But his true calling was to remain hidden in the darkness, move unseen, and strike at unsuspecting enemies from the shadows to kill them in one fell blow. The task of escaping the Red Colosseum unnoticed was much easier for him than that of conquering it, as all three shadows glided into the darkness. The skin of the four-armed demon he inhabited turned from obsidian black to pale gray once again, and Sunny swayed, sensing his strength and resilience vastly diminish. He gritted his teeth, and then gestured for Elyas to follow. While Saint disappeared into the darkness, the two of them headed toward the exit from the dungeon. They walked through the silent corridors, sensing the cold wind blow past, washing the stench of the dungeon off their aching bodies. Since it was night and the battles were not supposed to continue until the morning, the Colosseum was mostly empty, devoid of the jubilant crowds that filled it during the day. Here and there, Sunny and Elyas still encountered the Warmongers, those who perhaps had duties to maintain, clean, and prepare the arena for the next day's slaughter. However, everyone they saw had already met Saint. Following in the wake of the taciturn demon, the two of them found only corpses. The followers of war had been killed ruthlessly and noiselessly, each requiring just one strike. With each death, Sunny's reserves of essence were replenished a bit more. But more importantly than that, the path to freedom was clear. Finally, after something that felt like an eternity, Sunny found his three shadows waiting silently before a small wooden door. He lingered for a second and then pushed it open. In front of him, there was a vast green meadow, and beyond it, nothing but boundless, vast, starlit sky.